The story of Plantagenet England does not begin with a single decisive moment of conquest or a clean transfer of power sealed by treaty and ceremony. It begins instead in the accumulated wreckage of a kingdom that had already endured decades of civil war, dynastic uncertainty, and institutional collapse. A kingdom whose fields had been burned, whose monasteries had been stripped, whose peasants had scattered, and whose barons had grown accustomed to a kind of violent autonomy that no single ruler had yet managed to dismantle. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The Plantagenet dynasty, which would come to dominate England and much of the surrounding world for more than 3 centuries, inherited not merely a throne, but a system of governance so deeply entangled with violence, coercion, and institutional terror that brutality was not an aberration within it, but rather its primary operating language. Understanding why Plantagenet England was so brutal requires understanding what England was before the Plantagenets arrived, what pressures shaped the institutions they built, what assumptions about power and human life governed the decisions of kings and barons and bishops, and what the experience of living within that system meant for the vast majority of people who left no records and whose suffering survives only in the gaps between official documents. The period stretching from the accession of Henry II in 1154 to the deposition of Richard II in 1399 encompasses some of the most consequential, most violent, and most structurally significant decades in the history of medieval European civilization. It produced legal innovations that altered the relationship between the state and the individual in ways that persist into the present. It produced military campaigns of extraordinary destructiveness both within Britain and across the wider world. It produced theological conflicts that ended in murder inside the most sacred spaces in the kingdom. It produced rebellions, executions, famines, plagues, and episodes of state-sponsored terror that reshaped the social landscape of an entire civilization. And it did all of this not in spite of the institutional frameworks being constructed during this period, but in many cases precisely because of them, because the mechanisms of governance that the Plantagenets developed were themselves instruments of coercive power, designed to extract, to control, to punish, and to expand. Even when the language in which they were articulated spoke of justice, order, and divine sanction, the conditions that made this brutality possible were not invented by the Plantagenets. They were inherited from a Norman settlement that had itself been established through one of the most comprehensive acts of organized violence ever visited upon a pre-existing English-speaking population. When William the Conqueror seized the English throne in 1066, he did not merely replace one king with another. He replaced an entire ruling class, redistributing the land holdings of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy among a relatively small group of Norman followers with a thoroughness and a speed that had no real precedent in the history of medieval European conquest. Within 20 years of the Battle of Hastings, the overwhelming majority of land in England was held by men who spoke French as their primary language, who maintained personal loyalties to the Norman duchy, who governed through a system of feudal obligation that treated land tenure as an instrument of political control, and who understood the relationship between lords and those beneath them in terms of a hierarchy of violence that was sanctioned by both secular and ecclesiastical authority. The Domesday Survey of 1086, that extraordinary administrative document commissioned by William to catalogue the assets of his new kingdom, was not merely a census or a property register. It was a demonstration of governmental ambition so total, so penetrating in its reach into the private economic arrangements of every manor and village in England, that contemporaries found it almost cosmically unsettling, comparing it to the record-keeping of divine judgment. The survey's very existence testified to a new relationship between the state and the individual, one in which royal authority claimed the right to know and to assess, and ultimately to tax every productive resource in the kingdom, regardless of existing custom, existing agreements, or existing understandings of local right. This Norman inheritance shaped everything that followed. The Plantagenets, who came to power in 1154, were themselves a product of the Norman settlement, descended through the female line from William the Conqueror and through the male line from the Counts of Anjou. A dynasty with its own traditions of aggressive territorial expansion, complex political marriage, and institutional violence. Geoffrey of Anjou, from whom the Plantagenet name derives through the genista plant that he supposedly wore in his hat, had built his power in the Loire Valley through a combination of military campaigning, strategic alliance-making, and the kind of ruthless administrative efficiency that the medieval nobility of France had developed over generations of competing for territorial control in a fragmented political landscape. His son Henry inherited these Angevin traditions and added to them the resources of the English throne, the Duchy of Normandy, and through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, control over vast territories in southwestern France that made him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe at the moment of his accession. The scale of the Angevin Empire, as historians have come to call this collection of territories that Henry governed, was itself a source of structural pressure that shaped the brutality of the Plantagenet system. Governing territories that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, that included populations speaking at least 4 distinct languages and operating under different legal customs and ecclesiastical arrangements, required administrative mechanisms of extraordinary reach and coercive power. The reforms that Henry II introduced to English governance in the decades following his accession were not primarily motivated by abstract ideals of justice, though they were articulated in the language of royal duty to protect subjects from injustice. They were motivated by the practical necessity of extending and maintaining royal authority over a kingdom that had spent the previous 19 years fragmenting under the pressures of civil war. The period known to historians as the anarchy, stretching roughly from 1135 to 1154, had demonstrated with terrible clarity what happened when royal authority collapsed in a feudal society. The competing claims of King Stephen and the Empress Matilda to the English throne had provided the baronial class with the opportunity to operate with minimal royal oversight, building private fortifications, raising private armies, exercising judicial powers that properly belonged to the crown, and extracting resources from dependent populations with a freedom from accountability that the Norman system had theoretically constrained but never fully eliminated. The chronicle accounts of this period, most famously the account preserved in the Peterborough manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, describe a landscape of systematic terror in which local strongmen tortured peasants to extract hidden wealth, burned villages, seized livestock, and operated networks of extortion that left entire regions depopulated and productive land abandoned. The chronicler's language is specific and harrowing, describing the imprisonment of men in underground dungeons, the suspension of victims by their thumbs, the use of knotted chains around the head to extract confessions of hidden treasure, the burning of towns so complete that an observer riding through them could not believe that anyone had ever lived there. Whether these accounts should be taken as literal description or as rhetorical amplification of genuine but less systematic disorder has been debated by historians for generations. What is not in dispute is that the conditions of civil war created environments in which the institutional constraints on violence broke down, in which private military power operated without meaningful accountability, and in which the suffering of dependent populations was not merely incidental but instrumentalized as a mechanism of economic extraction. This was the England that Henry II inherited, and the institutional response he developed to address it was itself a system of coercive power, so thoroughgoing in its ambitions and so penetrating in its reach that it created new forms of violence even as it suppressed old. The common law system that Henry II and his advisors developed and extended during the decades of his reign between 1154 and 1189 represents one of the most significant institutional-wise achievements of the medieval period, and also one of the most consequential exercises in the extension of coercive state power over the lives of ordinary people in English history. The development of royal courts with jurisdiction over an expanding range of disputes, the dispatch of royal justices on circuits throughout the kingdom to hear pleas on the king's behalf, the elaboration of the jury system as a mechanism for gathering local knowledge and converting it into legally actionable testimony, the creation of standardized writs that allowed individuals to invoke royal authority against local lords in disputes over land and inheritance. All of these innovations had the effect of drawing more and more of the population into direct relationship with the machinery of royal governance. This was, from one perspective, a story of the expansion of legal protection and the erosion of the arbitrary power of local lords over those beneath them. From another perspective, equally valid and perhaps more immediately relevant to the people who actually experienced the system, it was a story of the expansion of the coercive reach of a centralized state into domains of life that had previously been governed by local custom and local relationship, with all the unpredictability, the expense, the physical danger, and the institutional terror that involvement with royal justice entailed. The courts that Henry's reforms created were not gentle or accommodating institutions. They operated through procedures that included ordeal, combat, and imprisonment. They extracted confessions through means that did not distinguish sharply between persuasion and torture. They enforced their judgments through mechanisms that included mutilation, hanging, and the destruction of property. And they operated within a framework of royal financial interest that meant the administration of justice was never entirely separable from the extraction of revenue, because amercements, fines, and the forfeiture of property to the crown were among the primary financial benefits that the king derived from the operation of his courts. The financial dimensions of Plantagenet governance were inseparable from its coercive character, and understanding the mechanisms through which the crown extracted resources from the kingdom's population is essential to understanding why the experience of living under Plantagenet rule was, for the overwhelming majority of people, an experience structured by the permanent background threat of institutional violence. The feudal system that the Norman settlement had imposed on England created a hierarchy of obligation in which every tenant held land in exchange for military service or other specified renders, and in which the crown's rights over its tenants-in-chief, the great barons, and ecclesiastical lords who held land directly from the king, included not only the right to military service, but the right to levy. Extraordinary financial exactions in specified circumstances, to control the marriages of widows and wards, to seize the revenues of estates during vacancies, and to demand payment of relief upon succession. These feudal incidents, as they were called, represented a system of legally sanctioned extraction that the crown administered with increasing efficiency and increasing aggression over the course of the Plantagenet period. The machinery of royal finance, managed through the Exchequer, that remarkable institution whose origins lay in the Norman period and whose procedures were elaborated and systematized over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, generated detailed records of what was owed, what had been paid, and what remained outstanding, records that allowed the crown to pursue debts with a persistence and a legal sophistication that private creditors could rarely match. The pipe rolls, those annual accounts of the Exchequer that survive in an almost unbroken sequence from the reign of Henry II onward, reveal a system of royal finance in which debt to the crown was a permanent condition for a substantial portion of the nobility and gentry, in which the threat of distraint, the legal seizure of property to satisfy outstanding obligations, was a constant presence in the calculations of anyone with significant land holdings, and in which the king's financial officers operated with powers of investigation and enforcement that could reach into the most intimate arrangements of family property and personal finance. The relationship between financial pressure and physical violence in the Plantagenet system was not merely metaphorical. The mechanisms through which the crown enforced its financial claims included the imprisonment of debtors, the seizure of livestock and household goods, the occupation of estates, and in extreme cases the public humiliation and physical punishment of those who were judged to have concealed assets or evaded legitimate obligations. The Jewish communities of medieval England occupied a particularly exposed position within this system, functioning as the primary source of credit for both the crown and the nobility during much of the 12th and 13th centuries, and subject to a regime of royal extraction that treated their accumulated wealth as a resource available for royal appropriation whenever the financial pressures of governance demanded it. The periodic tallages levied on the Jewish community extraordinary taxes demanded at the crown's discretion and enforced through imprisonment and the threat of expulsion represent one of the clearest examples of the Plantagenet system's capacity to convert the productive activity of a captive population into royal revenue through the direct application of coercive power. The massacre of the Jewish community of York in 1190, in which several hundred people died either at the hands of a debt-cancelling mob or by their own choice rather than face forced conversion and killing, took place within a broader context of royal financial exploitation that had left the Jewish community simultaneously indispensable to the credit needs of the nobility and entirely without the political protection that might have allowed to them to defend themselves against the consequences of their exposed position. The events at Clifford's Tower in 1190 were not simply an outbreak of popular anti-Semitism, though anti-Semitic ideology was certainly present in the motivations of the attackers. They were the culmination of a system in which the Jewish community had been placed in an impossible position by the very mechanisms of royal governance that nominally protected them, a system in which their survival depended on the king's willingness to extend protection, and in which that protection was itself a financial instrument calibrated to the crown's own interests, rather than to any durable principle of human security. The ecclesiastical dimension of Plantagenet governance added another layer of institutional complexity to the already dense web of coercive relationships through which the kingdom was managed. The Church in medieval England was not a separate institution operating in a clearly defined spiritual domain alongside a secular state. It was deeply embedded in the governmental structures of the kingdom, providing the educated administrators who staffed royal chanceries and courts, owning approximately 1/3 of the cultivable land in England, exercising independent jurisdictional authority over an enormous range of disputes through its own court system, and claiming exemptions from royal taxation and royal judicial oversight that created permanent friction with the crown's ambitions to extend its authority over the entire kingdom. The conflict between Henry II and Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, which culminated in Becket's murder inside Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, is the most famous expression of this structural tension, but it was representative of a broader pattern of institutional conflict that ran through the entire Plantagenet period. The specific issues in dispute between Henry and Becket, primarily the question of whether clergy accused of criminal offences should be tried in royal courts or only in ecclesiastical courts, and whether royal officials should be permitted to interfere with appeals to Rome, were not merely personal or theological quarrels. They were disputes about the boundaries of two competing systems of institutional authority, both of which claimed the right to govern significant aspects of the lives of everyone in England, and neither of which was willing to accept a subordinate position in relation to the other. The murder of Becket on the 29th of December 1170, carried out by 4 knights who had heard Henry's expression of frustrated rage at Becket's continued defiance and interpreted it as an implicit command, was a spectacular demonstration of the way in which personal loyalty, institutional violence, and political calculation were entangled within the Plantagenet system of governance. The knights who killed Becket Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard Le Breton were not psychopaths or criminals operating outside the norms of their society. They were members of the royal household, operating within a system in which personal service to the king was understood to include the application of violence when the king's honour or authority was perceived to be at stake. The fact that they killed Becket in a sacred space, that they struck him in front of witnesses, that one of them struck so hard that his sword broke on the cathedral pavement, and he described afterwards what he had done in terms that suggested pride rather than shame. All of this speaks to the normalization of extreme violence. As an instrument of political action within the Plantagenet court culture, Henry's subsequent penance, his public humiliation at Canterbury, his submission to flogging by the monks of the cathedral, was not merely a theatrical performance of royal contrition. It was a recognition that the murder had created a political crisis of the first order, that Becket's death had made him a martyr, whose cult would almost immediately challenge the very royal authority whose frustrations had contributed to his killing, and that the only available response was a public acknowledgement of royal guilt sufficiently dramatic to satisfy both ecclesiastical authority and the expectations of a popular religiosity that was already transforming Becket into a saint. The speed with which Thomas Becket was canonized less than 3 years after his death, in 1173, and the extraordinary popularity of his cult, which made Canterbury Cathedral one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in Europe within a generation of his murder, testifies to the way in which violence against sacred persons and sacred spaces could generate its own forms of institutional power. The pilgrimage trade that grew up around Becket's shrine was economically significant for Canterbury and the surrounding region. The political significance of the cult was even greater, because it provided a permanent reminder of royal liability for the murder of the most senior ecclesiastical figure in the kingdom, a reminder that subsequent kings could never entirely escape, and that ecclesiastical authority could deploy whenever the crown's ambitions threatened to encroach too deeply on church independence. The brutality of Becket's murder, in other words, did not simply produce horror and condemnation in the short term. It produced, over the longer term, a complex reconfiguration of the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical authority that shaped the institutional landscape of England for generations. The reign of Richard I, who held the English throne from 1189 to 1199, provides a different kind of window onto the brutality of the Plantagenet system, one that reveals how the mechanisms of royal governance functioned when directed not primarily inward toward the kingdom's own population, but outward toward territories and peoples that the Plantagenet imagination categorized as legitimate targets of conquest and conversion. Richard's crusade to the Holy Land, which occupied the central years of his reign and consumed resources that had been extracted from the English population through a combination of extraordinary taxation and the liquidation of royal assets on a scale that contemporaries found astonishing, was understood by those who planned and executed it not as an act of aggressive imperialism, but as a sacred obligation, a military campaign in service of divine purposes, whose prosecution justified the application of violence on a scale that would have been morally problematic in other contexts. The recruitment of armies for the crusade, the organization of the logistics of a military expedition that would travel thousands of miles to fight in unfamiliar terrain against opponents who possessed both military sophistication and the advantages of local knowledge, required the full mobilization of the Plantagenet administrative system in ways that demonstrated both its remarkable efficiency and its fundamentally coercive character. The Saladin tithe of 1188, levied to finance the crusading expedition, was assessed at 1/10 of the revenues and movable property of every person in the kingdom who was not themselves taking the cross, and it was collected with a thoroughness and a ruthlessness that generated widespread resentment and accusations of fraudulent assessment on the part of the collectors. The mechanism of assessment relied on local juries presenting the value of their neighbours' property, which created opportunities for both underassessment driven by solidarity and overassessment driven by personal enmity. And the disputes that arose from these assessments reveal the way in which the financial machinery of royal governance was experienced at the local level, as a system of both communal negotiation and institutional coercion. Richard's conduct of the crusade itself, particularly the massacre of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners at Acre in August of 1191, has generated extensive historical debate about the standards of military conduct that applied within the crusading context, and the extent to which Richard's decision represented a pragmatic military calculation, a breach of negotiated agreements, or something that contemporaries would have recognized as an atrocity even within the moral framework of crusading violence. The prisoners at Acre had been taken when the city surrendered to crusading forces in July of 1191, and their fate had been made the subject of negotiations between Richard and Saladin that involved the exchange of the prisoners for the return of the true cross, the release of Christian captives, and the payment of a substantial ransom. When Saladin failed to meet the agreed terms within the specified timeframe, Richard ordered the prisoners killed in full view of the Muslim army, an act that served the immediate tactical purpose of preventing the prisoners from becoming a logistical burden and a potential security risk as the crusading army prepared to advance south along the coast, and that also sent a message about the consequences of negotiating in bad faith. at least from the Crusaders' perspective. The killing was carried out systematically, by sword and by lance, and the accounts of it, in both Christian and Muslim sources, agree on the basic facts of what happened, even while disagreeing about the moral weight to be assigned to it. What is most significant for understanding the Plantagenet system is not the massacre in isolation, but the context of moral reasoning within which it was understood. The application of extreme violence against people who had been made prisoners, whose lives had been the subject of formal negotiation, was not understood by Richard, or by most of his contemporaries, as a straightforwardly criminal act. It was understood as a military decision made under conditions of operational necessity, in a context in which the rules governing the treatment of prisoners were less clearly defined than later legal developments would make them, and in which the sacred character of the crusading mission provided a framework for justifying actions that might have been more clearly condemned in other contexts. The domestic consequences of Richard's crusading absence were themselves a demonstration of the structural brutalities built into the Plantagenet system of governance. The Regency government that administered England during Richard's absence operated with the full apparatus of royal coercive power, but without the personal authority that the king's physical presence provided. And the result was a period of institutional instability that allowed both the financial exploitation of the kingdom's resources and the political ambitions of competing noble factions to operate with reduced restraint. The rebellion of Prince John, Richard's brother, during the period of Richard's captivity following his capture by Duke Leopold of Austria in 1192, revealed the fragility of the institutional loyalties that the Plantagenet system depended on, and the speed with which the machinery of royal governance could be turned to the purposes of internal factional conflict when the authority of the king himself was temporarily absent or impaired. The ransom demanded for Richard's release 150,000 marks of silver, a sum equivalent to approximately 2.5 times the annual revenue of the English crown, was extracted from the English population through a combination of extraordinary taxation, the seizure of church plate, and the imposition of feudal obligations that pushed the mechanisms of royal financial extraction to their absolute limits and generated long-lasting resentment that would contribute to the political crisis of John's reign. The reign of King John, stretching from 1199 to 1216, represents, in many respects, the crisis point of the Plantagenet system, the moment at which the structural contradictions built into a mode of governance based on the continuous expansion of royal coercive power collided with the organized resistance of a baronial class that had the resources, the military capacity, and the political motivation to challenge that power directly. John's reputation for brutality is well established in the historical record, though historians have debated the extent to which the specific acts attributed to him represented unusual personal cruelty, or merely the normal operating procedures of Plantagenet governance applied with less political skill than his predecessors had shown. The murder of his nephew Arthur of Brittany, who was John's primary rival for the Plantagenet inheritance, and who disappeared into royal captivity in 1203, was almost certainly carried out on John's orders, and possibly by John himself. And contemporaries who had known Arthur and who observed the circumstances of his disappearance drew the obvious conclusion about royal responsibility with a directness that the language of formal political discourse normally obscured. The loss of Normandy to Philip Augustus of France in 1204, which followed Arthur's disappearance, and which contemporaries and later historians have connected to the political consequences of Arthur's fate in terms of the loyalty that John's actions cost him among the Norman baronage, fundamentally altered the relationship between the English crown and its continental territories in ways that would shape the political development of both England and France for generations. Stripped of his continental territories, John directed the enormous coercive capacity of the Plantagenet administrative system inward, toward the extraction of resources from the English kingdom itself, with an intensity and a systematic thoroughness that the baronial class found intolerable. The financial records of John's reign reveal a system of royal extraction operating at levels that had no precedent in the history of the English monarchy. With scutage, the payment of money in lieu of military service levied at rates and frequencies that violated the customary understanding of what the crown was entitled to demand, with forest law enforced with a ferocity that converted what had been an irritating but manageable system of royal monopoly over woodland and game into an instrument of systematic financial persecution, with the judicial system operated as a revenue-generating mechanism in which amercements and fines were imposed for offences so trivial and so vaguely defined that the threat of legal action became a tool of political control as much as an instrument of justice. The political crisis that culminated in Magna Carta in 1215 grew out of this combination of institutional grievance and immediate financial pressure. As a coalition of barons, who had individual reasons to resent the specific ways in which John's governance had damaged their particular interests, organised a collective resistance that John's military position, weakened by the loss of Normandy and the defection of significant portions of the English baronage, was ultimately insufficient to overcome. Magna Carta, sealed at Runnymede in June of 1215, is one of the most consequential documents in the history of constitutional governance, and its significance has been interpreted and reinterpreted by every subsequent generation according to the political needs and intellectual frameworks of its own time. For the purposes of understanding Plantagenet brutality, what is most significant about Magna Carta is not the document itself, but what it reveals about the experience of those who negotiated it. The specific clauses of the Charter limiting the Crown's ability to demand scutage without baronial consent, establishing that no free man should be imprisoned or dispossessed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, restricting the operations of the forest courts, requiring that royal officials have proper legal authority for their actions, prohibiting the sale or denial or delay of justice. Each of these provisions corresponds to a specific experience of institutional abuse that the baronial class had accumulated over the preceding decades. The Charter was not an abstract philosophical statement about the rights of individuals in relation to the state. It was a practical catalogue of grievances arising from the operation of a system of governance that had been using its coercive powers in ways that the most powerful people in the kingdom found insupportable. If the most powerful people in the kingdom found the system insupportable, the conditions experienced by those lower in the social hierarchy, the free peasants, the villeins, the urban workers, the women who had no independent legal standing, the Jews who were excluded from the Charter's protections, the Welsh and Scottish populations who were intermittently subjected to English military power, were correspondingly more extreme and correspondingly less visible in the documentary record. The military campaigns through which the Plantagenet kings attempted to extend and maintain their authority over the other peoples of the British Isles represent some of the most systematically brutal episodes in the history of medieval warfare in northwestern Europe. The conquest and colonization of Ireland, initiated under Henry II following the Anglo-Norman invasion of 1169 and 1170, proceeded through a combination of military violence, land seizure, and the imposition of discriminatory legal arrangements that placed the indigenous Irish population outside the protection of common law and treated them as a categorically inferior group whose land, labour, and resources were available for exploitation by the settler colonists who arrived in the wake of military conquest. The legal distinction between the English, born in Ireland, who enjoyed the full protection of common law, and the native Irish, who were categorised as outside that law's protection and who could be killed, dispossessed, and enslaved with minimal legal consequence, was built into the institutional framework of Plantagenet governance in Ireland from the earliest stages of the colonial enterprise and would persist in various forms for centuries. The physical violence of the initial conquest, documented in contemporary accounts that describe the burning of settlements, the destruction of crops, the killing of non-combatants, and the systematic dispossession of the Gaelic aristocracy, was followed by the structural violence of colonial governance, in which the legal apparatus of the Plantagenet state was deployed not to protect the existing population, but to facilitate their subordination and exploitation. The campaigns of Edward I against Wales, which culminated in the conquest and incorporation of the Welsh principalities into the English realm, in the 1280s, followed a pattern of military aggression, institutional transformation, and cultural suppression that represented the most complete exercise of Plantagenet coercive power over a neighbouring people. Edward's two Welsh campaigns, of 1276 to 1277 and 1282 to 1283, involved the deployment of military resources on a scale that had no precedent in previous English operations in Wales, including the recruitment of large infantry forces from various parts of England and the construction of a network of castles so comprehensive in its geographic distribution and so technically sophisticated in its design that it remains one of the most remarkable military engineering achievements of medieval Europe. The castles that Edward constructed at Flint, Rhuddlan, Aberystwyth, Builth, Harlech, Conwy, Caernarfon, and Beaumaris were not merely military installations. They were statements of permanent occupation, designed to project royal power into the landscape with a physical permanence that made the impermanence of Welsh political independence visible to everyone who moved through that landscape. The execution of Dafydd ap Gruffydd in October of 1283, following his capture at the conclusion of the Second Welsh Campaign, was conducted with a ritual thoroughness that was itself a statement of royal authority. Dafydd was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the first recorded use of this form of execution for a noble prisoner in English history, and the parts of his body were distributed to different towns in England as a demonstration of royal power and a warning to anyone who might contemplate similar resistance. The brutality of this execution was not incidental. It was performative, designed to communicate through the treatment of a body the absolute nature of royal sovereignty over those who challenged it. The Statute of Wales of 1284, through which Edward organised the governance of the conquered territories, imposed English administrative and legal institutions on Wales in ways that systematically dismantled the existing structures of Welsh law and custom. The replacement of Welsh law Cyfraith Hywel, the ancient legal tradition attributed to the 10th century king Hywel Dda with English common law in criminal matters, represented not merely an administrative convenience, but a cultural assault on one of the most distinctive elements of Welsh identity, because Welsh law had encoded values and relationships specific to Welsh society in ways that English common law, developed in response to very different social conditions, could not accommodate. The Welsh were not simply being given new legal rules. They were being told that their existing rules were illegitimate, that the ways in which they had organised family relationships, property inheritance, compensation for personal injury, and communal responsibility were not merely different from English practice, but inferior to it, in ways that made their replacement by English institutions an act of improvement rather than suppression. This combination of physical violence, institutional imposition, and cultural delegitimization was characteristic of the Plantagenet approach to the peoples on England's periphery, and it established patterns of colonial governance that would have consequences extending far beyond the medieval period. Edward I's campaigns against Scotland, which occupied the final decades of the 13th century and the opening years of the 14th, represent the outer limit of Plantagenet imperial ambition in the British Isles, and they produce some of the most sustained and systematic military devastation visited upon any population within the reach of English royal power during the medieval period. Edward's initial involvement in Scottish affairs arose from the dynastic crisis created by the death of Margaret, Maid of Norway, in 1290, which left the Scottish succession disputed between multiple claimants and provided Edward with the opportunity to assert his authority as feudal overlord of Scotland, a claim that the Scottish political community contested but was temporarily in no position to resist. The process by which Edward selected John Balliol as King of Scotland in 1292, conducted through the elaborate legal procedure known as the Great Cause, appeared on the surface to be a model of procedural fairness, but it was in practice a mechanism for establishing English overlordship of Scotland on terms that made Scottish political independence untenable. When Balliol and the Scottish political community attempted to assert that independence through an alliance with France in 1295 and 1296, Edward's military response was immediate. overwhelming and deliberately exemplary in its violence, the sack of Berwick in March of 1296, in which Edward's forces killed a substantial portion of the town's civilian population following its capture, was understood by contemporaries as a deliberate act of exemplary terror, a demonstration of what resistance to English power would cost. The number of dead is disputed in the sources, with figures ranging from several thousand to the entire population, and the methodological difficulties of establishing reliable casualty figures for medieval military actions are well understood. What is not disputed is that the killing of civilians in Berwick was ordered, or at minimum permitted by Edward, that it was understood by those present as a policy decision rather than a military accident, and that it served the political purpose of communicating the consequences of Scottish defiance to the wider political community of Scotland and of Europe. The subsequent military campaign of 1296, which swept through most of lowland Scotland with a speed and effectiveness that left the Scottish political community temporarily without the capacity for organised resistance, included the seizure of the Stone of Destiny from Scone, the inauguration stone on which Scottish kings had been crowned for generations, whose removal was a direct assault on the ceremonial and symbolic resources through which Scottish kingship was constituted, and the removal of Scottish governmental records to England, an administrative decapitation designed to undermine the institutional continuity of Scottish governance, the Scottish resistance that organised itself around William Wallace following the disaster of 1296, and that achieved its most spectacular success at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September of 1297, demonstrated that the conquest of Scotland was far less complete than Edward's initial campaign had suggested. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge, in which an English army commanded by the Earl of Surrey was caught while crossing a narrow bridge and destroyed in detail by a Scottish force that exploited the terrain with extraordinary tactical intelligence, was followed by a campaign of raiding into northern England that demonstrated the offensive potential of Scottish resistance and the vulnerability of English border communities to the consequences of English aggression further north. The English response to Stirling Bridge and to the continuing Scottish resistance that followed Edward's victory at Falkirk in 1298 involved the systematic devastation of Scottish agricultural resources through campaigns of burning, seizure, and destruction that were specifically designed to eliminate the economic foundation of Scottish resistance by destroying the crops, livestock, and stored provisions that a resisting population needed to sustain both its fighters and its civilian population. These campaigns of deliberate agricultural destruction, which Edward's forces carried out with methodical thoroughness in lowland Scotland, represent one of the earliest examples in English military history of what would later be called a strategy of attrition through economic devastation, and their consequences for the Scottish civilian population: starvation, displacement. The destruction of years of agricultural investment were severe and long-lasting. Wallace's capture and execution in 1305 brought the most famous phase of Scottish resistance to its conclusion, and the manner of his execution at Smithfield in London was itself a carefully staged performance of royal authority over a defeated enemy. Like Dafydd ap Gruffydd before him, Wallace was subjected to the full procedure of hanging, drawing, and quartering, with the additional element that his head was displayed on London Bridge, and his quartered body distributed to Berwick, Stirling, Newcastle, and Perth as a demonstration of royal power and a warning to those who might be inspired by his example. The precise details of his treatment, the specific humiliations inflicted before death, the public character of the execution, the geographic distribution of his remains were not spontaneous cruelties, but deliberate communications of state power, readable by contemporary audiences as a precise language of political dominance. That Wallace had himself presided over acts of considerable violence, including the reported killing of the English sheriff of Lanark, in circumstances that suggest personal vengeance as much as political action, and that the raiding campaigns he led into northern England had visited considerable suffering on English civilian populations, does not diminish the calculated nature of his execution, but rather illustrates the way in which violence at this level of political conflict was not a departure from normal governance, but its most concentrated expression. The experience of ordinary people living within the Plantagenet system those whose names appear in documents only when they owed money, when they were accused of offences, when they were assessed for taxation, or when their deaths created legal procedures around the disposition of their property, was shaped by a set of material conditions and social arrangements that made physical vulnerability, economic insecurity, and institutional exposure permanent features of daily life. The overwhelming majority of the English population during the Plantagenet period were villeins, people whose legal status placed them in a position of personal dependence on the lord of the manor in which they lived, who owed labour services and other renders to that lord, who could not leave their manor without his permission, who could not bring legal actions in royal courts against their lord for actions taken in his capacity as lord, and whose relationship to the land they worked was defined not by ownership but by customary tenure, whose terms were subject to the lord's interpretation, and whose security depended on the lord's goodwill and the community's collective memory of what had always been done. The distinction between villainage and freedom was one of the most consequential legal categories in medieval English life, determining access to the royal court system, the ability to engage in certain kinds of commercial transactions, the right to enter the church or to send children to study, and the degree of vulnerability to arbitrary economic extraction by the lord of the manor. The labour services owed by villeins to their lords, typically involving multiple days each week of work on the lord's demesne land, with additional obligations during critical periods of the agricultural calendar such as harvest, when the entire community's labour might be required on the lord's fields before the villain's own crops could be gathered, represented a form of institutionalized labour exploitation so deeply embedded in the social arrangements of medieval England that contemporaries understood it not as injustice, but as the natural order of things, sanctioned by custom, by law, and by the theological interpretation of social hierarchy that the Church provided. The sermons of medieval clergy, the legal treatises of royal officials, the didactic literature written for the education of the aristocracy, all took for granted a social order in which the great mass of the population was destined to labour, so that a much smaller group could govern, fight, and pray on their behalf, and in which the obligation of labouring people to submit to the authority of those above them was as self-evident as the obligation of children to obey their parents. This ideological framework did not eliminate resistance. The evidence of medieval court records, of seigneurial accounts, of manorial surveys, testifies to continuous small-scale resistance against the exactions of lords and officials in the form of concealed assets, falsified measurements, deliberate underperformance of labour services, and the persistent assertion of customary rights against the encroachments of those in authority. But it shaped the terms in which resistance was both expressed and suppressed, and it provided the institutional violence of the Plantagenet system with a moral vocabulary that made its operations appear legitimate, even to many of those on whom it was most heavily exercised. The manorial courts, through which lords exercised jurisdiction over their villain tenants, were institutions of considerable practical importance in the daily governance of medieval communities, and they operated with a combination of communal participation and seigneurial control that made them simultaneously expressions of local self-governance and instruments of lordly power. The business of the manorial court, recording land transactions, enforcing labour obligations, adjudicating disputes between tenants, regulating common rights in fields and woodland, enforcing the lord's monopolies over mills and ovens, managing the succession to villain holdings, was conducted through procedures that combined the testimony of local jurors with the authority of the lord's steward, creating a system in which local knowledge was mobilized in service of the lord's interests. The amercements that manorial courts imposed for infringements of their regulations provided lords with a regular income stream derived from the ongoing monitoring of their tenants' behaviour, and the consistency with which manorial court rolls record the imposition of fines for brewing without licence, for allowing animals to stray into the lord's fields, for failing to attend the court, for marrying without the lord's permission, for the death of a villain's best animal claimed as herio by the lord, reveals the degree to which the daily texture of village life was permeated by the potential for institutional interference and financial extraction. The experience of famine, which struck the English population, with particular severity during the second decade of the 14th century, reveals with terrible clarity how the structural vulnerabilities built into the Plantagenet system translated into mass death when environmental conditions created a crisis that the existing institutions were equipped to exploit, rather than to mitigate. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, which followed a sequence of catastrophically wet summers that prevented normal harvests from ripening across much of northwestern Europe, killed between 10 and 15% of the English population. Estimates vary considerably, given the fragmentary nature of the evidence. But the general scale of mortality is not in dispute, and did so in a context in which the institutional mechanisms of the Plantagenet state continued to operate in ways that intensified rather than relieved the suffering of the parting. Rural population. The Crown's financial demands did not diminish during the famine years. The wars in Scotland that Edward II inherited from his father continued to require taxation and military recruitment that drew resources from communities already stretched to the limit of their subsistence. The great lords and ecclesiastical institutions that controlled the primary grain surpluses, the reserves of stored grain that represented the primary buffer against harvest failure, used those surpluses not primarily as a welfare resource for starving dependent communities, but as a commercial asset whose value rose precisely because famine conditions created intense demand. The resulting combination of harvest failure, continued extraction, and the concentration of available food resources in the hands of those with least need of them produced conditions of mass starvation in which people ate dogs, cats, bark, and in some documented cases, the flesh of the dead, in which the bodies of the poor lay unburied in the streets of towns, and in which the crime rates recorded in the court rolls of the period included a striking increase in theft, robbery, and violence that reflects the desperation of people with nothing left to lose. The institutional response to the Great Famine was not primarily humanitarian. It was regulatory and coercive, concerned with maintaining order, preventing theft, and ensuring that the Crown's own financial requirements continued to be met, even as the population died around the apparatus of governance. Proclamations fixing the prices of grain and prohibiting hoarding were issued, but enforcement was inconsistent, and the mechanisms of the manorial system that determined how agricultural surpluses were distributed were not fundamentally altered. The experience of the Great Famine thus exemplifies a pattern that runs throughout the Plantagenet period, in which crisis revealed the brutal priorities of a system designed for extraction rather than protection, crisis, and in which the suffering of dependent populations was understood by those who administered the system not as a failure of governance, but as a natural consequence of conditions beyond human control, amenable to prayer and to moral regulation, but not to the kind of systematic redistribution of resources that would have required the institutional apparatus of the state to operate against the interests of those who controlled it. The Black Death of 1348 and 1349, which killed approximately half the English population within the space of roughly 18 months, represents the most catastrophic demographic event in the history of England, and its consequences for the Plantagenet system were both immediate and transformative. The plague arrived in England through the southwestern ports in the summer of 1348, carried by the same commercial networks that connected England to the wider European economy and that had been intensifying throughout the Plantagenet period, and it spread through the population with a speed and a thoroughness that overwhelmed every existing institutional response. The mortality figures are staggering and are derived from a combination of documentary evidence and the records of episcopal registers that show the replacement of clergy dying in their parishes at rates that sometimes reach 60 or 70% within a matter of months. The accounts of ecclesiastical and manorial institutions that record the death of tenants and servants, the court rolls that document the escalating numbers of vacant holdings following the deaths of their holders, and from the paleopathological evidence of mass burial pits discovered at multiple sites across England whose contents testify to the speed and the scale of the dying. The social consequences of this mass mortality were immediate, as the collapse of labour supply in the countryside produced economic conditions in which the surviving agricultural labourers found themselves in a position to demand wages and conditions far beyond those they had accepted before the plague, and in which the rigid legal structures of Villainage that had maintained the labour market in a condition of enforced immobility began to crack under the pressure of a demographic reality that made their enforcement impractical. Statute of Labourers of 1351, through which the Crown attempted to restore pre-plague wage rates and reimpose the conditions of labour service that the demographic collapse had made untenable, represents one of the most instructive examples in English history of the Plantagenet system's reflexive resort to coercive institutional mechanisms in response to a social change that threatened established hierarchies of power, economic advantage. The statute required that all able-bodied men and women below a specified social level who did not have sufficient means of subsistence must accept employment at the wage rates prevailing before the plague. On pain of imprisonment, it attempted to reimpose the geographic immobility of the villain by requiring that workers not leave their home parishes to seek better conditions elsewhere. It prohibited the giving of alms to able-bodied beggars on the grounds that charity allowed people to avoid the labour service they owed to society. The gap between the statute's ambitions and its enforcement capacity was, in the event, enormous, because the demographic and economic conditions that had produced the crisis of labour supply were not amenable to legal suppression, and employers competing for scarce labour routinely violated the statute's provisions in ways that royal officials could document but not effectively prevent. The statute was nonetheless enforced with sufficient frequency and sufficient harshness to cause considerable suffering to individual workers who were caught attempting to exercise the market power that the plague had accidentally created for them, and the resentment generated by its operation was among the accumulating grievances that would eventually find expression in the peasants' revolt of 1381. The military culture of the Plantagenet aristocracy, the values, practices, and institutions through which the nobility organized its relationship to violence and maintained its identity as a fighting class, was simultaneously one of the defining features of the period and one of the primary mechanisms through which systematic violence was normalized and glorified within the social world of the dominant class. The tournament, which developed from a relatively unstructured form of group combat in the early 12th century into an elaborate ritual of martial display, governed by increasingly detailed rules of conduct by the late 13th century, served multiple social functions within the aristocratic culture of the Plantagenet period. It provided training in the techniques of mounted combat. It created opportunities for the display of personal valor and martial skill before socially significant audiences. It facilitated the formation of the personal bonds between fighters that were essential to the functioning of the feudal military system. And it provided occasions for the exchange of ransom payments that represented one of the primary mechanisms through which military activity was converted into personal wealth for successful fighters. The violence of tournament combat, even in its more regulated later forms, was real and sometimes fatal. Contemporary accounts of major tournaments record deaths, serious injuries, and the capture of horses and armor whose forfeiture represented significant financial loss for the captured party. The early tournaments, the melee of the 12th century, in which groups of fighters ranging across large tracts of countryside attacked each other with weapons only marginally blunted from their battlefield. Equivalents were essentially training exercises in organized violence of a kind that blurred the boundary between simulation and actual warfare in ways that contemporaries found both useful and occasionally alarming. The experience of actual warfare, as opposed to its simulated tournament version, was for the ordinary soldier the infantryman recruited from the peasantry, the mounted archer who formed the core of the English army's offensive capability, the Welsh spearman conscripted into royal service, an experience of physical danger, institutional violence, economic exploitation, and social displacement of a fundamentally different character from the chivalric adventure that aristocratic culture celebrated. The campaigns in France that defined the later Plantagenet period, particularly the remarkable English victories at Cressy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, with Agincourt falling technically outside the Plantagenet period, but in the immediate legacy of it were achieved in part through the military effectiveness of common soldiers armed with the longbow, a weapon whose mastery required years of physical conditioning from early childhood and whose psychological and physiological effects on its targets, the slow and horrible death from arrow wounds that became infected in the absence of any effective medical treatment, were not the heroic imagery of chivalric narrative, but the grinding reality of medieval military experience. The ordinary soldiers who drew those bows were not motivated primarily by chivalric ideals. They were motivated by the prospect of wages, by the possibility of plunder, by the social penalties for those who evaded military obligation, and by the immediate fear of what their officers would do to them if they failed to perform adequately in circumstances where the collective discipline of a formation of archers was essential to military effectiveness. The conduct of war in France, from the earliest Plantagenet campaigns of Henry II and his sons through the great chevauchée of Edward III's reign, involved the systematic devastation of civilian agricultural resources as a primary military strategy. The chevauchée, the mounted raid, through enemy territory, burning crops, destroying villages, seizing livestock, killing anyone who attempted resistance, was not a byproduct of military operations conducted with limited regard for civilian welfare. It was a deliberate strategic choice, based on the analysis that destroying the agricultural productivity of a territory would undermine the financial and logistical capacity of the ruler of that territory to maintain military resistance. Edward III's Great Raid through northern France in 1346, which preceded the Battle of Cressy and which covered several hundred miles of French territory, left a trail of burned towns and villages, destroyed harvests, and killed or displaced civilian populations that contemporary accounts describe in terms that convey both the scale of the destruction and the systematic character with which it was carried out. English chroniclers record these campaigns with a combination of practical satisfaction at their military effectiveness and occasional moral unease about the suffering of non-combatant populations, an unease that they generally resolved through the theological framework that attributed the suffering of the French to the sins of the French king, rather than to the actions of the English military. French accounts of the same events convey rather more directly the experience of populations who watched their homes burned, their animals driven away, and their harvests destroyed before they had been gathered, and who faced the prospect of starvation in the months that followed with resources that had been comprehensively depleted. The ransoming of prisoners, which was the fate of noble captives in medieval warfare, rather than the killing that faced common soldiers taken in battle, created a financial dimension to military violence that shaped the strategic calculations of all parties to the major conflicts of the Plantagenet period. The captivity of John II of France, following his capture at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, produced one of the largest ransom demands in medieval history, 3 million gold écus, a sum whose negotiation and partial payment occupied years of diplomatic activity and whose financial consequences for France were severe. Edward III's exploitation of this captivity and his management of the negotiations that produced the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 demonstrated the Plantagenet capacity to convert military success into financial and territorial gain through mechanisms that operated within the framework of chivalric norms, while serving purposes that were straightforwardly material and political. The captive king, in his comfortable English imprisonment, attending tournaments and hunting with his captor, maintained the ceremonial aspects of his royal dignity, while his country was bled financially to secure his release, a situation that captures, in miniature, the way in which the elaborately codified system of aristocratic violence that chivalric culture had developed served simultaneously as a constraint on the worst excesses of noble warfare and as a mechanism for the systematic exploitation of defeated enemies by victorious ones. The religious dimension of violence in Plantagenet England extended beyond the specific case of the Becket murder and the crusading campaigns to pervade the entire institutional framework through which the kingdom was governed and the entire cultural system through which violence was understood and legitimated. The Church's role in the Plantagenet system was not simply to provide spiritual services and theological justification for the existing order, though it performed both of those functions with considerable efficiency. The Church was itself an institutional participant in the systems of extraction, coercion, and jurisdictional competition that characterized Plantagenet governance. Episcopal courts, which operated alongside and sometimes in conflict with royal courts, exercised jurisdiction over an enormous range of matters including matrimonial disputes, inheritance of personal property, debt cases involving breach of faith, and the conduct of all persons in holy orders. The tithe system, through which the Church extracted 1/10 of the agricultural production of the entire country as a contribution to its financial support, represented an additional layer of extraction on a population already subject to manorial rents and royal taxation, and its collection was enforced through the threat of excommunication exclusion from the sacraments and from the community of Christian believers, which was understood not merely as a spiritual penalty, but as a social and economic consequence of potentially severe practical importance. The Inquisition never operated in England with the systematic thoroughness it achieved in some continental territories, but heresy was prosecuted under English law with methods that included imprisonment, torture of suspects, and burning alive of those found guilty. And the periodic heresy trials that marked the later Plantagenet and early post-Plantagenet period reveal the capacity of ecclesiastical authority, operating in cooperation with royal enforcement power, to visit extreme physical violence on those whose theological positions deviated from orthodoxy. The Lollard movement, associated with the Oxford theologian John Wycliffe and his followers in the final decades of the 14th century, produced England's first systematic heresy prosecutions under the statute De Heretico Comburendo of 1401, technically beyond the Plantagenet period, but a direct consequence of theological tensions that had been building throughout the 14th century, and the burning of William Sawtry in that same year inaugurated a series of executions for heresy that would continue intermittently for over a century. The violence of burning, chosen as the punishment for heresy because it was understood to destroy the body in ways that prevented the physical resurrection that Orthodox theology promised the righteous, was the most public and the most deliberately theatrical of all the forms of institutional execution available to medieval authority, and its use against heretics communicated both the specific danger that theological deviation was understood to represent and the absolute nature of the authority, both ecclesiastical and royal, that was prepared to use extreme physical violence in defense of doctrinal conformity. The social experience of women within the Plantagenet system adds a further dimension to the understanding of structural brutality that the period represents, one that operates differently from the more spectacular forms of political and military violence, but that is no less systematic in its character and no less consequential in its effects. The legal position of women in medieval England was shaped by a combination of common law rules, ecclesiastical regulations, and customary practices that varied according to social class, marital status, and geographical location, but that shared a common feature of treating women primarily as dependents, whose legal identity was subsumed within that of a male guardian father, husband, or in the case of widowhood, the king or a male heir, rather than as autonomous individuals with independent legal standing. The common law doctrine of coverture, which held that a married woman's legal identity was merged with that of her husband, and that she could not independently own property, make contracts, sue or be sued in the royal courts, or engage in most forms of independent legal action, was not a natural or inevitable feature of human social organization. It was a specific institutional choice, embedded in the developing common law of the Plantagenet period, that systematically disabled women's capacity for legal self-protection and made them dependent on the goodwill of the men within whose households they lived for protection against the full range of physical, economic, and social harms to which they were vulnerable. The legal category of rape in medieval England illustrates the complexity of women's position within the Plantagenet legal system with particular clarity. Rape was recognized as a serious offense under both royal law and ecclesiastical law, and the Plantagenet period saw the development of increasingly specific legal procedures for its prosecution. The Second Statute of Westminster of 1285, promulgated during Edward I's reign, made rape a felony punishable by death, replacing an earlier system under which the primary remedy was a lesser penalty. But the procedural requirements for successful prosecution, the requirement that a woman raise hue and cry immediately after the assault, that she report to the coroner and to the nearest men of repute within a very short time frame, that she display evidence of the assault on her body and clothing, were calibrated in ways that made successful prosecution extremely difficult, even in cases where the assault had clearly occurred, and that placed the burden of proof in practice on the victim rather than on the accused. The actual rate of conviction for rape in the surviving medieval court records is remarkably low, even by comparison to the already low conviction rates for other serious offences, a disparity that reflects not the rarity of the offence, but the structural obstacles to its successful prosecution within a legal system designed, staffed, and interpreted by men whose fundamental assumptions about women's credibility and sexual conduct shaped every stage of the judicial process. The management of aristocratic women as property resources by the Plantagenet state was among the most explicit demonstrations of the way in which the system's coercive power operated across the entire social spectrum. The wardship of female heirs, which gave the king or lord the right to control the marriage of widows and orphan daughters who held significant landholdings, was managed as a financial asset, with the right to arrange a ward's marriage sold to the highest bidder without any necessary reference to the preferences of the woman in question. The experience of aristocratic women who found themselves widowed and in the king's wardship, or whose marriages were controlled by lords to whom the wardship right had been sold, was shaped by the recognition that their personal choices about partners and living arrangements were simply not relevant considerations within the institutional framework that governed them. Magna Carta's clause, promising that widows should not be compelled to marry against their will, one of the most explicitly protective provisions of that document, testifies both to the existence of the abuse it sought to remedy and to the limited effectiveness of documentary prohibition in the face of the structural incentives that motivated the behaviour it was attempting to constrain. The violence of everyday life in Plantagenet England, violence that appears in the records of royal courts and coroners' inquests, that punctuated the rhythms of agricultural labour and seasonal festival, that erupted in taverns and marketplaces and along disputed boundary lines, was different in character from the organised state violence of military campaigns and judicial executions, but equally revealing of the social conditions of the period. The homicide rates that can be estimated from the surviving medieval criminal records are substantially higher than those of any subsequent period in English history for which reliable statistics exist, suggesting a social environment in which lethal violence was significantly more common than it would become in later centuries. The causes of this elevated violence are multiple and contested the ready availability of weapons in a society in which bearing arms was both a status marker and a practical precaution, the limited effectiveness of formal mechanisms for resolving disputes before they escalated to physical confrontation, the honour culture of both the nobility and the peasantry that made the failure to respond physically to perceived insults a marker of social weakness with practical consequences, the consumption of alcohol in a society in which ale was a dietary staple rather than a social luxury, but they speak consistently to a social environment in which the boundary between dispute and lethal assault was both physically and conceptually closer than it would become under the more thoroughly policed conditions of later periods. The patterns of violence recorded in medieval coroners' rolls, the extraordinary documentary record created by the Plantagenet system's requirement that an elected county official investigate and record all sudden deaths within his jurisdiction, reveal a social world in which people killed each other with whatever came to hand, in which the most common instrument of fatal violence was an agricultural implement or a domestic tool rather than a weapon designed for killing, in which the contexts of violence were overwhelmingly domestic and communal rather than military or political, and in which the relationship between perpetrator and victim was more often one of familiarity than of enmity between strangers. Neighbours killed neighbours in disputes over boundary markers, over straying animals, over water rights, over debts, over accumulated slights whose precise origins had sometimes been forgotten by the time violence erupted. Husbands killed wives, and wives occasionally killed husbands, in circumstances that the coroner's inquest procedures documented with a matter-of-factness that itself reveals the extent to which domestic violence was understood as an unremarkable feature of the social landscape, rather than as an exceptional occurrence requiring special explanation. The flight of perpetrators from justice, the most common outcome of homicide cases in the medieval period, because the practical difficulties of apprehension meant that most killers who fled immediately were never caught, meant that the accountability that the Plantagenet legal system claimed to provide was in practice highly unevenly distributed, falling most heavily on those without the resources or connections to make effective flight possible, and most lightly on those whose social position gave them alternative options for managing the legal consequences of their actions. The political crisis of Edward II's reign, stretching from his accession in 1307 to his deposition and death in 1327, represents one of the most dramatically violent episodes in the entire Plantagenet period, and it illuminates with exceptional clarity the mechanisms through which the political violence of the aristocratic class operated when the conventions governing it broke down. Edward II inherited from his father a kingdom whose institutional apparatus was among the most sophisticated in Europe, but whose political culture was under intense strain from the combined pressures of Scottish resistance, baronial ambition, and the financial demands of continuous warfare. Edward's personal character and political judgment, as they appear in the documentary and narrative sources of his reign, suggest a king who was capable of intense personal loyalty, who possessed aesthetic sensibilities that found expression in activities, theatrical performance, digging, thatching, rowing that his contemporaries found incompatible with royal dignity, and who formed attachments to individual favourites, whose influence over royal patronage generated resentment among the baronial community with a speed and an intensity that his father's more politically calculating management of personal relationships had generally avoided. The rise of Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whom Edward elevated to the earldom of Cornwall and who became the focus of baronial anger about the distribution of royal patronage and royal attention, crystallized a political conflict whose deeper roots lay in the structural tensions of Plantagenet governance, but whose surface expression took the form of a personal drama of royal favoritism and baronial outrage. Gaveston's murder by the Earl of Lancaster and his associates in June of 1312, following his capture during a period of baronial armed resistance to royal authority, was conducted with a ritual deliberateness that communicated the baronial community's judgment on the legitimacy of his position. He was taken from the custody of the Earl of Pembroke, who had offered guarantees of his safety, and was subjected to a brief mockery of legal process, and was then beheaded on Blacklow Hill by men in Lancaster's service. The breach of Pembroke's guarantee of safe conduct, the extrajudicial character of the proceedings, and the involvement of some of the most powerful men in England in a killing that was legally murder, regardless of the political justifications offered for it. All of these features of Gaveston's death reveal the thin, permeable boundary in the Plantagenet political system between legitimate political action and criminal violence, a boundary whose location was essentially contested and whose enforcement depended on the relative political and military power of the parties to the dispute, rather than on any clearly defined and consistently applied principle of law. Edward's response to Gaveston's killing, his pursuit of legal revenge against Lancaster and his associates through the mechanisms of royal justice, his simultaneous military weakness that prevented him from enforcing his will against those who had defied him, his eventual effective capitulation to baronial control in the period of the ordinances demonstrated the limits of royal coercive power when it lacked the military backing that gave it practical force, and set the stage for the political catastrophe of the following decade, the Battle of Bannockburn in June of 1314, in which Edward's attempt to relieve the siege of Stirling Castle was catastrophically defeated by Robert Bruce's Scottish army, was the most complete military disaster suffered by an English royal army in the entire Plantagenet period, and its consequences for the political position of the English crown extended far beyond the immediate military situation in Scotland. The defeat at Bannockburn did not simply fail to resolve the Scottish question. It demonstrated the military incapacity of Edward's regime in ways that emboldened its domestic opponents and that left the northern counties of England exposed to Scottish raiding that would devastate the communities of Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland for the following decade and more. The Scottish raids that followed Bannockburn's systematic campaigns of burning, livestock seizure, and human kidnapping for ransom that ranged deep into Yorkshire and Lancashire were not incidental consequences of the military situation, but deliberate strategies designed to extract financial tribute from English communities who paid protection money to avoid destruction and whose suffering was directly connected to the political failure of a Plantagenet regime unable to provide the military protection that was one of the primary justifications for royal authority. The political situation of Edward's reign moved through a series of crises in which the relationship between the king and his baronial opponents alternated between periods of uneasy accommodation and episodes of open armed conflict, until the emergence of an alliance between Queen Isabella, who had been sent to France in 1325 to negotiate with her brother, the French king, and who instead formed an intimate political and personal partnership with the exiled English baron, Roger Mortimer, created the conditions for the invasion that would end Edward's reign. Isabella and Mortimer's invasion of England in September of 1326 was conducted with a speed and a popular support that revealed the depth of domestic discontent with Edward's regime and the rapid collapse of royal resistance, the abandonment of the king by his own household, the flight of the Despensers, who had been Edward's primary favourites, and the focus of baronial resentment in the latter years of his reign. The king's eventual capture in Wales in November demonstrated how thoroughly the political foundations of his authority had been eroded by 15 years of military failure, financial mismanagement, and the alienation of the baronial community. The Despensers, father and son, were executed with the full judicial ritual of traitors, the father at Bristol and the son at Hereford, with the specific forms of their execution hanging, drawing, and quartering in the case of the younger Hugh Despenser, conducted with particular deliberateness, including a period of suspension on a specially constructed high gallows that allowed the crowd to see clearly chosen for their communicative power as statements of judgment on men whose use of royal power had been judged illegitimate by those who now controlled the apparatus of governance. Edward II's own end, in Berkeley Castle, in September of 1327, following his deposition by Parliament in January of that year, has generated more historical controversy than almost any other event in the Plantagenet period, with the precise circumstances of his death disputed since the 14th century and still not conclusively resolved. The official announcement of his death as being from natural causes was immediately doubted by contemporaries, and the accounts of murder that circulated describing various methods of killing, including the insertion of a red-hot iron internally, designed to kill without leaving externally. Visible wounds may reflect historical reality or may represent the narrative elaboration of subsequent generations, processing the political reality of a deposed and captive king whose continued existence was an inconvenience to those who had displaced him. What is not in doubt is that Edward died in royal custody, that the political incentives for his death were clear and strong, that the men responsible for his custody had both the means and the motive to bring about his death, and that the formal investigation of his death that might have established the facts with legal clarity was never conducted in ways that produced definitive conclusions. The reign of Edward II thus ended, as it had been conducted, in conditions of violence and institutional failure, with the mechanisms of royal justice unable to establish clear accountability for the final act of a political catastrophe that had consumed 19 years and thousands of lives. The 100 Years' War, that long and intermittently catastrophic series of conflicts between England and France that began formally in 1337 with Edward III's assertion of his claim to the French throne, and that would occupy the political energies of the Plantagenet and successor dynasties for over a century, provides the broadest canvas on which to observe the full range of Plantagenet military brutality in its developed form. The war was not primarily a conflict about the personal honour of dynastic claimants, though it was articulated in those terms by the political culture of the period. It was a conflict about the structural relationship between the English crown's continental possessions and the expanding authority of the French monarchy, about control over the economically productive regions of Gascony and the cloth manufacturing towns of Flanders, whose commercial relationships with England were of enormous financial importance, and about the dynamics of aristocratic military culture in a period when the opportunities for profitable violence abroad provided both a release for domestic tensions and a mechanism for social advancement that the Plantagenet political system actively encouraged. The remarkable English victories of the first phase of the war, Sluys at sea in 1340, Cressy on land in 1346, the subsequent siege and capture of Calais were achieved through a combination of the tactical superiority of the longbow in the defensive-offensive formations that English commanders had developed through decades of Welsh, Scottish warfare, and the logistical and financial efficiency of an administrative system that could mobilize and supply large armies for extended campaigns. But the campaigns that produced these victories involved the application of devastating force against French civilian populations in the territories through which the English armies moved, and the suffering of those populations was an integral part of the military strategy rather than an unfortunate but unavoidable byproduct of it. The campaign of 1346 that culminated at Crecy began with the landing of Edward's army in Normandy and proceeded through a systematic ravaging of the Norman countryside that contemporary English accounts describe with undisguised satisfaction in terms of the wealth captured, the towns burned, and the terror spread among the French population. The chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, writing in English service, describes the campaign in terms that make clear both the deliberate character of the destruction and the cultural framework within which it was understood as legitimate. The towns burned were those of an enemy king. The wealth seized was legitimate plunder. The terror spread was militarily functional, and the suffering of French civilians was the natural consequence of their king's failure to defend them. The town of Caen, one of the largest in Normandy, was sacked by English forces in July of 1346, with a thoroughness that left it significantly depopulated and economically damaged for years. The targeting of Caen was not random. It was a deliberate assault on one of the most important urban centres in Norman French territory, designed to demonstrate the incapacity of the French crown to protect its subjects and to transfer significant amounts of French wealth to English hands through plunder. The subsequent march eastward toward Paris and then northward to Cressy involved continuous raiding of the surrounding countryside, creating a corridor of devastation that served both immediate logistical purposes, feeding the army from the resources of the territory it moved through, and longer-term strategic ones, by demonstrating the reach and effectiveness of English military power. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 represents the most dramatic eruption of popular violence against the structures of the Plantagenet system in the entire period, and its causes, conduct, and suppression illuminate almost every dimension of the structural brutalities that had been accumulating over the preceding decades. The revolt grew out of a specific immediate trigger, the poll taxes of 1377, 1379, and 1380, the last of which attempted to shift the financial burden of the continuing war in France from the wealthy to the general population through a tax levied at a flat rate on every adult, combined with the accumulated resentments of a generation that had experienced the Black Death, the repeated frustration of the economic expectations that post-plague labour shortage had created, the aggressive enforcement of the Statute of Labourers, the continuing demands of military taxation for a war that seemed to produce no lasting results, and the corruption of royal officials and lawyers whose self-serving exercise of institutional power was experienced at the local level with a directness and an immediacy that the political abstractions of court narrative could not adequately capture. The revolt began in Essex and Kent in late May and early June of 1381, arising from resistance to the collection of the third poll tax in two circumstances where collectors had used illegal and physically invasive methods to establish the age of potential taxpayers who were attempting to present themselves as under the taxable age. The rapidity with which local resistance became coordinated, regional uprising, the speed with which the rebels marched on London and forced open the city's gates with the apparent complicity of significant portions of the London population, and the remarkable discipline with which the revolt was initially conducted, with explicit targeting of specific individuals and institutions rather than generalized looting, and with ideological articulation of demands that included the abolition of serfdom, the limitation of rents, the right of workers to contract their labor freely, and the radical leveling of social hierarchy symbolized in John Ball's famous question about who was the gentleman when Adam delved and Eve span. All of this speaks to a degree of social organization and ideological sophistication among the rural and urban working population that the dominant narrative of medieval history, focused on the perspectives of the literate and the powerful, had systematically occluded. The murder of Archbishop Simon Sudbury, the Lord Chancellor Robert Hales, and other high officials by the rebels at the Tower of London in June of 1381 was the most spectacular episode of violence in the revolt, and it demonstrated both the capacity of the popular movement to reach the most powerful institutional figures in the kingdom, and the limits of the discipline that the revolt's leadership had attempted to impose. Sudbury's death, in particular, carried enormous symbolic weight. He was not merely a royal official, but the most senior clergyman in England, beheaded by popular violence in a context in which the revolt's targets had been specifically identified as corrupt officials rather than as institutional authority itself, and the manner of his killing, which required multiple strokes to complete, was recorded by horrified chroniclers in language that expressed both revulsion at the act and a kind of unwilling acknowledgement of the desperation of those who had committed it. The young King Richard II's personal courage in meeting the rebels at Smithfield on the 15th of June, 1381, following the killing of the rebel leader Wat Tyler by the Mayor of London William Walworth in circumstances that remain disputed, and his improvised promise to the rebel host that their demands would be met, was a remarkable political performance that effectively dispersed a movement whose military potential, in the moment before Tyler's death, had been genuinely threatening to the stability of the regime. The subsequent suppression of the revolt, conducted through the royal courts in the weeks and months following the dispersal of the rebel host, involved the execution of those who had participated in the most serious acts of violence. The estimates of executions range from approximately 150 to several times that number, depending on the sources consulted and the definitional choices made, and the formal revocation of all the promises that Richard had made at Smithfield and at the subsequent meeting with the Essex rebels at Walthamstow. The revocation of these promises, conducted in terms that asserted the legal invalidity of any concession made under duress, and that categorically denied the legitimacy of the rebels' demands, was accompanied by the famous statement attributed to the young king that villains were and would remain villains, and that no concession of freedom would be made to them except through the king's own free will and grace. This statement, if accurately reported, captures, with extraordinary compression, the fundamental attitude of the Plantagenet system toward the social expectations of those at the bottom of the hierarchy, the expectation that social improvement must come through the gracious condescension of those above, rather than through the assertion of rights by those below, and the explicit assertion that the institutional violence used to maintain this arrangement was not an abuse of power, but the legitimate exercise of authority over those who owed submission to their social superiors. The reign of Richard II himself, which occupied the years from 1377 to 1399, and which ended in the deposition and death that would terminate the direct Plantagenet line, represents a final chapter in the dynasty's history that recapitulates in concentrated form many of the structural tensions and institutional contradictions that had characterized the entire preceding period. Richard's attempts to develop a style of royal authority that was more explicitly absolute in its theoretical claims than any of his predecessors had asserted his development of court ceremonial that emphasized the sacred unchallengeable character of royal power, his commissioning of portraits that showed him enthroned in a posture of divine-like authority, his prosecution of the Lord's appellant who had challenged his rule in the crisis of 1388, his use of blank charters to extract retrospective confessions of guilt from opponents, his abuse of the legal mechanisms of the common law to pursue vengeance against political enemies. All of these elements of his later rule represented an attempt to resolve the structural tension between royal authority and baronial power that had run through the entire Plantagenet period by simply asserting the primacy of royal will over every other consideration. The attempt failed, as it had failed when John had made a similar attempt in very different circumstances at the beginning of the 13th century. Because the practical limits of royal coercive power in a feudal society meant that the king's ability to act as an absolute sovereign was always contingent on the cooperation of a baronial class that had both the military resources and the institutional mechanisms, parliament, above all, but also the informal networks of military alliance and political coordination that the magnate class had maintained throughout the Plantagenet period to organize effective resistance when its fundamental interests were sufficiently threatened. Henry Bolingbroke's invasion of England in the summer of 1399, his rapid gathering of support from the baronial community, and the collapse of Richard's military position with a speed that mirrored the collapse of Edward II's position 70 years earlier, were followed by Richard's deposition in Parliament in September of 1399 and his death in Pontefract Castle in February of 1400. In circumstances as disputed and as politically convenient for those who controlled the apparatus of governance as the death of his great-great-uncle had been 3/4 of a century before, the Plantagenet dynasty, in its direct male line, ended as it had begun in the violent resolution of a succession crisis whose underlying causes lay in the structural contradictions of a system of governance that had always required the application of extreme force to maintain itself, and that had never developed adequate institutional mechanisms for managing the limits of royal power and the competing claims of those who were subject to it. The 3 centuries of Plantagenet rule had transformed England in ways whose consequences would extend for centuries beyond the dynasty's end. Institutionally, through the development of the common law, parliament, and the royal administrative system. Economically, through the commercial expansion and urban development of the 12th and 13th centuries, and the social transformations of the post-plague period. Militarily, through the development of tactics and organization that had made English armies consistently formidable on the European stage. Culturally, through the literary achievements of a period that produced Geoffrey Chaucer, William Langland, the great cycle plays, and the visual magnificence of Gothic cathedral architecture in its fully developed English form. But the brutal character of the system through which these achievements had been wrested from the human and material resources of the kingdom was not incidental to them. It was constitutive of them, because the institutional violence of the Plantagenet state was the mechanism through which the resources necessary for these achievements were extracted, concentrated, and deployed. And the suffering of those who produced that wealth was the invisible foundation on which the visible splendours of the dynasty were constructed. The forest law of Plantagenet England deserves particular attention as a system of institutionalized ecological and social violence that has received less sustained historical attention than the more spectacular episodes of military and judicial brutality, but that affected the daily lives of a substantial portion of the pod. English rural population, with a thoroughness and a consistency that made it one of the most universally resented features of royal governance throughout the period. The royal forests of medieval England were not forests in the modern sense of the word. They were not necessarily even primarily wooded areas, though many of them did contain significant areas of woodland. They were areas of land subject to a special legal regime, the forest law, that protected the king's rights over game animals and over the habitat that game required, and that imposed restrictions on the activities of those living within or near the forest areas that affected every aspect of their agricultural and domestic economy. The extent of land under forest law in Plantagenet England was enormous. At its greatest extent, under Henry II, forest law applied to approximately 1/3 of the entire land area of England, encompassing large areas of agricultural land, common pasture, and settlement as well as woodland. The administration of this legal regime was conducted through a specialized system of forest courts, staffed by forest officers, wardens, verderers, regarders, agisters whose primary function was to detect and punish infringements of forest law, and whose secondary function was to generate revenue for the Crown from the penalties imposed on those who violated the forest regulations. The specific offences punished under forest law illuminate the ways in which the regime intersected with the daily subsistence activities of rural communities in ways that made it simultaneously economically significant and profoundly oppressive. Taking deer from forest areas without royal license was a serious offence, whose penalties had been reduced from the mutilation and death that Norman forest law had initially specified to fines and imprisonment by the time of the Plantagenet period, but which remained severe enough to represent a significant deterrent and a significant source of revenue when imposed. Asserting the clearing of woodland for agricultural use was prohibited without royal license, preventing forest communities from expanding their cultivated area in response to population growth. The grazing of animals in forest areas was regulated through the payment of fees and the operation of seasonal restrictions that added to the costs of pastoral farming in affected regions. The taking of wood for fuel, fencing, and building was restricted to amounts specified by forest officials, whose judgments were not always guided by the actual subsistence needs of the communities they supervised. The keeping of dogs within forest areas was regulated to prevent their use in poaching, with the mutilation of dogs' paws, the removal of 3 toes from each forefoot, a procedure known as expeditation required for any dog large enough to chase deer, a provision that reduced the working capacity of animals that served important functions in herding and guarding livestock, the air of the forest, the periodic visitation of forest courts that brought the full machinery of forest justice to bear on accumulated infringements, was among the most dreaded institutional events in the calendar of communities subject to forest law. These visitations, which might occur at intervals of several years, generated enormous amusement bills against the communities within the forest area, who were collectively responsible for reporting infringements that individual members had committed and for paying the fines imposed for those infringements. The social dynamics of these collective responsibilities, the pressure on community members to report their neighbours' violations in order to reduce collective liability, and the countervailing solidarity that sometimes led communities to protect each other from forest officials at the cost of increased collective immersement, are visible in the records of forest heirs that survive from various points in the Plantagenet period, and they reveal the ways in which the administrative mechanisms of royal governance could simultaneously create community solidarity through shared resistance and tear communities apart through the incentives for betrayal that collective punishment systems inevitably generated. The Forest Charter of 1217, which modified the most extreme provisions of the forest regime and confirmed certain communal rights within forest areas, represented a partial acknowledgement of the social costs of the system, but it did not dismantle the fundamental framework of royal monopoly over game and its habitat, and the forest remained a significant source of both popular resentment and royal revenue throughout the remaining Plantagenet period. The treatment of prisoners within the Plantagenet legal system provides a final and particularly revealing window onto the quotidian brutalities of the period, one that complements the spectacular public executions that have attracted most historical attention by documenting the conditions of confinement and the experiences of those who passed through the system of royal and manorial detention, without necessarily meeting a public end. The prisons of medieval England, the great royal fortresses like the Tower of London and Corfe Castle that housed the most politically dangerous detainees, the county jails that held those awaiting trial at the royal courts, the ecclesiastical prisons maintained by bishops for offenders against church law, the prison chambers of manor houses in which lords detained recalcitrant tenants were institutions whose primary function was containment rather than rehabilitation, and whose operating conditions reflected the low value that the system placed on the physical welfare of those detained within them. The county jails in particular, whose population consisted primarily of those awaiting trial rather than those who had been convicted of offences, held their inmates in conditions that combined extreme physical discomfort, inadequate food, no systematic provision of heat or light, limited sanitation, and the shared space of communal confinement that facilitated the spread of infectious disease, with the uncertainty of not knowing when or how their legal situation would be resolved. The phenomenon known as jailer's fever, identified in later periods as typhus, was endemic in medieval prisons and killed a substantial number of those detained in them before they could be brought to trial, adding an additional and entirely arbitrary dimension to the punitive consequences of involvement with the legal system for those of insufficient means to arrange more comfortable confinement through payment to jailers. The financial dimension of imprisonment, the practice through which those with means could purchase better conditions, more food, freedom to move within the prison, and in some cases, virtual liberty within a defined area, created a system in which the punitive experience of confinement was dramatically stratified by wealth, with those who could afford to pay the jailer's fees experiencing something approximating a restricted form of normal life, and those without means experiencing something much closer to the full severity of medieval incarceration. This stratification was not understood as a corruption of the prison system, but as a normal and acceptable feature of it, reflecting the broader assumption that the capacity to pay for better treatment was itself an appropriate criterion for receiving it. The debtor who could pay the jailer lived in something approaching reasonable comfort. The debtor who could not lived in conditions that might kill him before the debt was resolved. This was not an accidental outcome of poorly designed institutions. It was the predictable result of a system that had never placed the physical welfare of poor prisoners among its operational priorities. The question of why Plantagenet England was so brutal does not, ultimately, have a single answer. The brutality of the period was not the product of exceptional individual wickedness among its kings, though some of them were undoubtedly crueler in their personal conduct than others. It was not the product of a unique cultural disposition toward violence among the English people, though the culture of the period normalized violence in ways that would be unfamiliar and disturbing to later generations. It was the product of a specific institutional configuration, the feudal state, in its English Plantagenet form, that combined the coercive mechanisms of royal governance with the violent traditions of aristocratic military. Culture, the exploitative logic of manorial agriculture, the discriminatory structures of a legal system that embedded social hierarchy in its fundamental categories, the crushing weight of financial extraction on populations with minimal reserves and minimal protection, and the theological framework of a church that legitimized the existing order while participating actively in its maintenance. These elements were not separate features of the period that combined accidentally to produce the violence that resulted. They were constitutive elements of a single system in which brutality was not a failure of the institutional design, but one of its primary outputs, the mechanism through which a small minority maintained its authority over a large majority, and through which the extraordinary social surpluses of medieval agricultural civilization were concentrated in the hands of those who had the military and institutional power to claim them. The legacy of this period extends in multiple directions that are not always easy to trace through the intervening centuries. The legal institutions that the Plantagenets developed, the common law, the jury system, the writ of habeas corpus in its earliest forms, the representative parliament, became the foundations of English constitutional development and eventually of the legal systems of many of the territories that England would subsequently colonize. The processes through which these institutions were developed and the violence that accompanied their development are inseparable from the institutions themselves, and understanding the Plantagenet origins of the common law requires understanding the coercive context within which that law was elaborated and the purposes it served in that context. The military traditions of the period, the tactical sophistication of English armies, the administrative efficiency of military mobilization, the ideological framework of crusading violence would extend their influence through the subsequent centuries of English and British history. shaping the conduct of wars whose participants understood themselves as operating within a tradition whose medieval origins they sometimes acknowledged and sometimes obscured. The social hierarchies of the period, though profoundly modified by the economic and demographic transformations of the post-plague centuries, left residues in land ownership patterns, in legal arrangements, and in cultural assumptions about the relationship between social status and entitlement to physical security that were far more durable than the formal institutional arrangements of feudalism. And the experiences of those who suffered most profoundly within the Plantagenet system, the villains who laboured under conditions of institutional coercion, the women whose legal incapacity made them dependent on the goodwill of male relatives for protection, the Jewish communities who were systematically exploited and eventually expelled in 1290, the Welsh and Scottish and Irish populations who were subjected to English military power and cultural suppression, left marks on the historical landscape that subsequent generations of historians have been slowly and incompletely learning to read. The administration of royal justice in the counties of Plantagenet England operated through a network of institutions whose physical geography and social character revealed as much about the system's priorities as the formal, legal rules that governed it. The county court, which met approximately every month and which brought together the free tenants of the county to conduct the business of royal justice under the supervision of the sheriff, was one of the primary meeting points between the institutional machinery of royal governance and the lives of the ordinary population. The sheriff who presided over these proceedings occupied a position of extraordinary importance in the local administration of royal power, responsible simultaneously for the collection of royal revenues, the execution of royal writs, the management of prisoners, the raising of military levies, and the conduct of legal proceedings, all of which gave him enormous practical authority over the people of his county and enormous opportunities for the kind of self-interested exploitation of that authority that the Plantagenet period documented with depressing consistency. The complaints about sheriffs that appear in narrative sources, in administrative records, in the provisions of Magna Carta, and in the popular literature of the period, most famously in the Robin Hood tradition, that crystallized during this period around the figure of a tyrannical sheriff of Nottingham, were not merely literary conventions. They reflected a widespread experience of local officials whose exercise of royal power served their personal financial interests, at least as much as the institutional purposes they were nominally appointed to serve. The itinerant justices who travelled through the counties on their judicial circuits, hearing the accumulated business of the royal courts in proceedings that might last several days in each county town, brought the full weight of royal judicial authority to bear on local disputes and local offences with an intensity that the regular county court could not match. The general heir, the most comprehensive form of royal judicial visitation, subjected the entire county, through which it passed, to a thorough investigation of its administrative and legal performance, requiring communities to account for every unexplained death, every presentment of offence, every failure to perform communal legal obligations, and, quote, every departure from the standards of governance that royal justice required. The amercements generated by the general heir were enormous, sufficient in some cases to represent a significant fraction of the annual income of the community being visited, and the experience of living through a general heir was sufficiently traumatic that chronicles record communities fleeing before the approach of the justices to avoid being caught up in proceedings that might result in financial ruin. The practical impossibility of compliance with all the technical requirements of the royal justice system meant that virtually every community in England was, at any given moment, technically in breach of some obligation whose discovery during a judicial visitation could result in amercement, and the arbitrary quality of which infractions were actually pursued and which were overlooked depended in part on the judgment and inclinations of the justices and in part on the ability of local communities and individuals to cultivate the relationships and deploy the resources that might divert official attention elsewhere. The relationship between the legal system and the social networks of personal obligation and reciprocal favour that structured medieval communities created a system of justice that operated in practice very differently from the formal rules that defined it in theory. The jury system, which Henry II had elevated into a primary mechanism of royal justice, was in theory a mechanism for gathering reliable local knowledge and converting it into legally actionable testimony. In practice, juries were composed of people with their own social networks, their own economic relationships with the parties to disputes, their own histories of favour given and favour owed, and their own calculations about the social consequences of different verdicts in communities where they would continue to live with the people about whom they were required to make determinations. The documented manipulation of jury selection and jury verdicts by local magnates with the resources to intimidate or reward jurors, a phenomenon that legal historians have studied extensively under the heading of jury tampering, represents not a corruption of the system from outside, but a response to the structural invitation that the system created by making the determination of legal disputes dependent on the opinions of people whose social position made them vulnerable to social pressure and susceptible to social incentive. The Plantagenet administration's responses to jury corruption, the development of procedures for challenging jurors, the increasing use of professional lawyers to manage proceedings, the creation of writs that allowed verdicts to be challenged in royal courts, elaborated the institutional machinery of justice without resolving the fundamental tension between the ideal of impartial determination and the social code. Reality of embedded partiality. The treatment of the poor within the Plantagenet legal system exemplified with particular clarity the ways in which formal legal equality, the common law's ostensible application to all free persons, regardless of status, was consistently undermined by the practical realities of a system in which access to legal remedies required resources that the poor did not have. The cost of initiating a legal action in the royal courts, the fees for writs, the expenses of travel to the court venue, the cost of legal representation, if any was sought, the lost wages of the days spent in attendance at proceedings that might be continued through multiple sessions, meant that the common law's protections were in practice available primarily to those with sufficient economic resources to afford the expense of invoking them. The poor, who were victims of violence, theft, or dispossession by more powerful neighbours, were not without legal remedies in theory. In practice, the combination of cost, the difficulty of securing evidence and witnesses against socially powerful opponents, and the vulnerability of poor complainants to retaliatory harassment by those they accused, meant that legal recourse was either unavailable or actively dangerous. The alternative mechanisms through which the poor might seek redress petition to royal authority, appeal to ecclesiastical courts, communal pressure through the village, communities' collective assertion of custom were available in some circumstances, but were consistently less effective than the formal legal remedies that economic circumstance placed beyond their reach. The political theology of the Plantagenet period, the complex of ideas about the relationship between royal authority, divine sanction, and natural law that both legitimized and constrained the exercise of power, deserves sustained attention as one of the primary intellectual frameworks through which the period's violence was understood by those who inflicted it, and, to a more limited extent, by those who suffered it. The concept of the king as God's vicar on earth, responsible for the governance of his people in accordance with divine law and subject to divine judgment for his exercise of that responsibility, was both a genuine theological belief and a powerful political instrument. It was a genuine belief in the sense that the kings of the Plantagenet period almost certainly did understand their authority in terms of a sacred obligation and did experience the rituals of coronation, the anointing with holy oil, that marked the transformation of a secular lord into a consecrated ruler as something more than political theatre. It was a political instrument in the sense that the claim to divine sanction could be deployed to justify the exercise of coercive power in ways that might otherwise require more explicit justification, and to delegitimize resistance on the grounds that opposition to divinely sanctioned authority was itself a form of sacrilege. The intellectual tradition of tyranny theory, the body of thought that distinguished between the legitimate king who governed in accordance with law and divine justice, and the tyrant who governed for his own benefit at the expense of his subjects, provided the framework within which the deposition of both Edward II, Richard II was articulated and justified. The argument that a king who violated the fundamental obligations of his office could legitimately be resisted and replaced was not straightforwardly available to medieval political thinkers, because the logic of divine sanction could as easily support the view that even a bad king was God's punishment for the sins of his people and should be endured as an act of penitence rather than resisted as an act of justice. The theological and political arguments through which the advisors of the baronial oppositions to Edward and Richard worked their way toward the conclusion that deposition was legitimate were laboured and sometimes inconsistent, reflecting the genuine intellectual difficulty of reconciling the theory of sacred kingship with the practical necessity of removing kings who had made their continued presence intolerable to those with the power to do something about it. The practical outcome in both cases, the forced abdication, the imprisonment, the death in custody, was determined not by the intellectual quality of the justifications offered for it, but by the distribution of military and political power among those directly involved. And the intellectual frameworks were post hoc rationalizations of outcomes that had already been determined on grounds that had more to do with force than with theology. The architectural achievements of the Plantagenet period, the extraordinary Gothic cathedrals, whose construction began in the late 12th century and continued throughout the 13th and 14th, the magnificent castle complexes built by Edward I in Wales, the great royal palaces whose surviving elements testify to the luxury and sophistication of the court culture they housed, were among the most visible demonstrations of the surplus extracted from the English economy through the mechanisms of the Plantagenet system. The construction of Lincoln Cathedral, begun in 1192, following the partial collapse of the earlier Norman structure, and completed in its essential form by the mid-13th century, involved the sustained application of enormous material resources and skilled labour over a period of more than 50 years, coordinated through the administrative capacities of the Lincoln diocese, and funded through a combination of episcopal income, voluntary donation, and the commercial proceeds of the cathedral city's position at the centre of a significant regional economy. The technical achievement of Lincoln's construction, the pioneering use of rib vaulting in forms that allowed greater height and more complex spatial effects than earlier Romanesque construction had achieved, the sophisticated management of lateral thrust through the system of flying buttresses that allowed the walls to be pierced with ever larger windows, the integration of sculptural programs with architectural structure in ways that made every surface of the building a vehicle for theological communication, was both a genuine artistic and engineering achievement and a demonstration of the capacity of the Plantagenet institutional system to concentrate and direct resources toward purposes that served the ideological interests of those who controlled it. The relationship between cathedral construction and the tars, a surrounding economy, was complex and often exploitative. The requisitioning of timber, stone, and labour for building projects under royal or episcopal authority could impose significant costs on communities that had no effective means of refusing, and the management of cathedral building finances sometimes involved practices, the sale of indulgences, the solicitation of donations under pressure, the diversion of charitable funds that were later criticised as abuses, but that were in the context of the period understood as legitimate mechanisms for raising funds for sacred purposes. The skilled craftsmen who worked on cathedral construction, the master masons, the carpenters, the glaziers, the sculptors occupied a specialised position within the economy that gave them somewhat more autonomy and somewhat better economic security than the general agricultural population, but that still placed them within networks of obligation and subordination that the Plantagenet system maintained with characteristic efficiency. The anonymous craftsman whose work survives in the carved capitals of Lincoln's nave, in the Purbeck marble columns of Salisbury Cathedral, in the magnificent wooden hammer-beam roofs of East Anglian parish churches, had names and lives whose details are almost entirely lost to history, preserved only in the occasional entry in an account roll or a contract document that records not their names, but their function and their cost. The commercial revolution of the 12th and 13th centuries, which transformed the English economy through the expansion of markets, the development of credit instruments, the growth of urban populations, and the deepening integration of England into the wider European economy through the wool trade and the cloth trade, created new forms of wealth whose relationship to the Plantagenet system of coercive extraction was as complex as that of the agricultural economy. The merchant class that developed in the towns of Plantagenet England in London, York, Bristol, Lincoln, Winchester, and the smaller market towns that multiplied across the English landscape during the economic expansion of the 12th and 13th centuries, occupied a social position that was defined simultaneously by their growing economic importance and their relative political weakness. Merchants were essential to the Crown's financial capacity. They provided loans, they managed customs revenues, they supplied the commercial credit that allowed royal financial operations to proceed across the gaps between tax collection, but they did not participate in the formal structures of political power in the way that the baronial class did, and their security depended on the maintenance of legal and commercial conditions that were shaped by negotiations in which they had limited direct voice. The development of the town as a legal community, with its own institutional framework, the borough charter, the guild system, the merchant courts that resolved commercial disputes, according to the customs of the trade, represented a partial carving out of spaces within the Plantagenet system in which the commercial class could operate with some degree of institutional autonomy. But these spaces were themselves dependent on royal grant and royal protection, and the Crown's ability to withdraw, restrict, or simply override the commercial privileges it had granted meant that the autonomy of the urban merchant class was always contingent rather than absolute. The wool trade, which was the primary driver of England's commercial integration into the European economy during the Plantagenet period, created economic relationships of extraordinary consequence that shaped both English domestic politics and English foreign policy in ways that are not always visible in the conventional political narrative of the period. English wool, particularly the fine wool produced by the sheep of the Cotswolds, the Welsh Marches, and the northern counties, was the raw material that supplied the great cloth manufacturing centres of Flanders and northern Italy, and the revenues that flowed from its export were among the most significant components of both royal income and baronial income during the 13th and 14th centuries. The customs system, established by Edward I in 1275, an export duty levied on wool, leather, and woolfells that became one of the most important and most consistently productive elements of royal revenue, represented the institutionalization of the Crown's claim to a share of the commercial prosperity that the wool trade generated, and the administration of the customs through the port towns created a new category of royal financial official whose activities intersected with the commercial interests of the merchant community in ways that generated both profit, conflict. The staplers, the merchants, authorized to handle the export of English wool through designated staple ports, first in various English towns and eventually at Calais, occupied a position of such importance to royal financial management that their organization became effectively a branch of royal fiscal administration, managing the flow of customs revenues and providing commercial credit to the Crown in ways that made the distinction between private commercial interest and public financial function almost impossible to maintain. The expulsion of the Jewish community from England in 1290, ordered by Edward I and carried out with an efficiency that testifies to the administrative capacity of the Plantagenet state as much as to its capacity for institutionalized cruelty, brought to its logical conclusion a process of systematic exploitation and social marginalization that had been ongoing throughout the Plantagenet period. The Jews of medieval England, whose presence in the country dated from the Norman Conquest, and whose economic function as the primary source of money-lending credit had made them indispensable to the financial operations of both the Crown and the nobility, had been subjected throughout the 12th and 13th centuries to a regime of royal exploitation that treated their accumulated capital as an asset available for periodic seizure, while simultaneously subjecting them to the discriminatory provisions of ecclesiastical law the periodic violence of anti-Jewish riots, and the legal disabilities that excluded them from most forms of productive participation in the majority economy. The tallages levied on the Jewish community extraordinary taxes demanded at the Crown's discretion, without any of the consultative procedures that governed ordinary royal taxation had by the mid-13th century, reduced the Jewish community to a fraction of its earlier economic capacity, as successive demands for immediate payment had forced the sale or abandonment of the loan securities that represented the primary asset of money-lending operations. The Expulsion of 1290, which required the Jewish community to leave England within a matter of months and permitted them to take only their movable goods while forfeiting their landed property and their outstanding loan securities to the Crown, was not an impulsive act of religious persecution. It was the final stage in a calculated process of economic extraction that had lasted for over a century, in which the Crown had used the Jewish community's legally vulnerable position to extract wealth that could be extracted from no other source on comparable terms, and then expelled the community once the extractable surplus had been largely exhausted. The experience of the Welsh population in the decades following the Edwardian conquest provides a sustained example of what colonial governance meant in practice for a subject population whose political autonomy had been eliminated by military force. The construction of the castle-town complexes that Edward established at Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris was accompanied by the deliberate planting of English settler communities in these new towns, whose borough charters gave them commercial privileges and legal protections explicitly denied to the Welsh population of the surrounding region. The Welsh were prohibited from settling in or trading in these new English towns, from bearing arms within their walls, from holding certain categories of urban property, and from participating in the governance of their own territories through the traditional mechanisms of Welsh law and Welsh political custom. The replacement of Welsh law by English common law in criminal matters, while theoretically extending the protections of royal justice to the Welsh population, in practice imposed a legal framework whose procedures, whose language, and whose social assumptions were foreign to the Welsh experience, and whose administration was conducted by officials with no stake in the welfare of the population they governed. The Welsh language, which the Welsh political community understood as a fundamental marker of their cultural identity, was not directly suppressed by Edwardian legislation, but the systematic exclusion of Welsh speakers from positions of authority in the colonial administration created practical incentives for linguistic assimilation that worked over generations to erode the social prestige of Welsh in contexts where official participation was valued. The cultural production of the Plantagenet period, the literature, the music, the visual art, the architectural achievement existed in a relationship of profound and not always comfortable intimacy with the violence that produced the conditions within which it was possible. The poetry of Geoffrey Chaucer, who lived and worked in the final decades of the Plantagenet period, and who wrote the Canterbury Tales during the 1380s and 1390s, under the patronage of a court culture that was simultaneously producing the political crises of Richard's reign, engaged with the social world of his time in ways that were simultaneously celebratory and critical, that observed the corruption and violence of the institutions around him with a detachment that was itself a form of moral seriousness. The knight who opens the Canterbury Tales is a figure of chivalric virtue whose biography encompasses decades of continuous military service in campaigns across the known world, in Prussia, in Lithuania, in Russia, in Spain, in North Africa, in the Eastern Mediterranean, a biography that reads, when examined closely, as a comprehensive catalogue of the crusading violence of the period, the systematic application of military force in service of religious and political purposes that Chaucer's contemporaries understood as both admirable and productive of unimaginable suffering. The ambiguity of Chaucer's presentation of the knight, the genuine respect for military prowess and personal virtue, combined with the ironic observation that he has arrived at the pilgrimage with his armour still marked with the rust of recent campaigns, is characteristic of the period's most sophisticated literary response to the violence of its own context. Acknowledging the moral complexity of institutions that were simultaneously generative of genuine human achievement, and constitutive of systematic human suffering. William Langland's Piers Plowman, composed and repeatedly revised over a period spanning the 1360s to the 1380s, engaged more directly with the social violence of the Plantagenet system, describing the condition of the labouring poor with a specificity and a moral urgency that represented one of the most sustained critiques of the social order available within the literary culture of the period. Langland's vision of a world in which the majority laboured in conditions of desperate poverty while the minority feasted in plenty, in which the mechanisms of governance served the interests of the powerful at the expense of the weak, and in which the church, that was supposed to provide moral leadership, had itself been corrupted by the wealth and power that its institutional position afforded it, drew on the same reservoir of popular discontent that would find its more violent expression in the peasants' revolt of 1381. The legal theory developed by John Wycliffe in the same period, which attacked the theological foundations of ecclesiastical property and the moral authority of a corrupt institutional church with an intellectual rigour that the church found genuinely threatening, demonstrated the capacity of the Plantagenet intellectual environment to produce fundamental challenges to the ideological foundations of the system, even from within its own institutional structures. Challenges whose consequences would extend far beyond the medieval period into the transformations of the Reformation and beyond. The ending of the Plantagenet dynasty in 1399 did not, of course, end the structural conditions that had made the dynasty's governance so brutal. The feudal social hierarchy persisted in modified forms for centuries. The common law, whose development had been one of the dynasty's most consequential institutional achievements, continued to operate through the courts that the Plantagenets had established, carrying forward both the protections and the exclusions that had characterized it in its medieval form. The military traditions of the period found their successors in the warfare of the 15th century, which would prove in some respects even more destructive in its domestic consequences than anything the Plantagenets had produced. As the Wars of the Roses brought the violence of aristocratic military culture to bear on the English body politic, with an intensity and a duration that the civil wars of the anarchy had perhaps anticipated, but not fully matched. The economic structures of the post-Plantagenet period, the persistence of villein tenure in modified forms, the continued concentration of landholding in the hands of a small aristocratic class, the slow and uneven development of the commercial economy, meant that the material conditions of the majority of the English population improved only gradually and unevenly in the centuries following the dynasty's end. The institutional violence that had been so characteristic a feature of the Plantagenet system did not disappear with the dynasty. It was inherited, modified, and in some respects intensified by the successor regimes, just as the Plantagenets had inherited and modified the institutional violence of the Norman settlement that had preceded them. The historical significance of the Plantagenet period cannot be reduced to its brutality, though that brutality was real and consequential and must be given its full weight in any honest accounting. The institutional achievements of the period, the development of the common law into one of the most sophisticated legal systems in medieval Europe, the creation of Parliament as a forum for the negotiation of royal power and political representation, whose long-term consequences would prove transformative for the history of constitutional governance, the administrative sophistication of the royal bureaucracy, the commercial and demographic expansion of the 12th and 13th centuries that created the conditions for England's emergence as a significant economic power. These were genuine achievements whose importance for subsequent history is not diminished by the recognition that they were produced within and through a system of institutional violence. Understanding both the achievements and the violence, and understanding the ways in which they were related to each other, rather than simply coexistent, is the task that the history of the Plantagenet period sets for those who engage with it seriously. It is a task made more difficult by the fact that most of the surviving evidence for the period was produced by and for the literate minority who benefited from the system, and that reconstructing the experience of those who suffered most comprehensively within it requires the patient and often inconclusive work of reading against the grain of documents whose primary purposes were administrative rather than testimonial. The voices of those who suffered within the Plantagenet system reach us only indirectly, refracted through the institutional processes that recorded their existence primarily when they were assessed, convicted, penalized, or killed. The villain, who refused a labor service and was amerced for it in the manorial court, appears in the court roll only as a name attached to a fine. The woman who reported an assault and found herself confronted with the evidentiary requirements that made prosecution effectively impossible leaves a trace in the Crown Pleas rolls, only as a case withdrawn or dismissed. The labourer who was imprisoned under the Statute of Labourers for leaving his home village in search of better wages appears in a jail delivery record as a name and an offence. The Jewish merchant who was tollaged for the 6th time in a decade and whose business consequently collapsed appears in the Exchequer records only as a declining entry in the assessment of the community's taxable capacity. These fragmentary presences in the documentary record are not silence. They are a specific and recoverable form of testimony, requiring different methods of reading from those appropriate to the narrative sources and the formal legal treatises that have traditionally dominated the historical literature of the period, but no less meaningful for that. The brutality of Plantagenet England was not an accident, not a failure of governance that better institutional design might have prevented, not a consequence of individual moral failings that better kings might have corrected. It was the systemic output of a form of social organization in which the mechanisms of governance were designed primarily to extract, to control, and to maintain hierarchy, and in which the physical security and material welfare of the majority were not recognized as ends in themselves, but only as means to the ends that the governing class recognized as legitimate: the maintenance of military capacity, the extension of royal authority, the support of ecclesiastical institutions, and the reproduction of the social arrangements that made the governing class's position possible. Recognizing this is not to adopt a simple narrative of oppressor and oppressed, or to deny the genuine complexity of the relationships between different groups within the Plantagenet social order, or to ignore the ways in which the period's institutional developments created real protections and real opportunities for people who had not previously had access to them. It is, rather, to insist that the full story of the period must include the experience of those for whom its institutions were primarily instruments of coercion rather than protection, and to recognize that the extraordinary flowering of cultural, intellectual, and institutional achievement that characterized the Plantagenet centuries was rooted in conditions of systematic human suffering, whose costs were borne by people whose names we mostly do not know and whose suffering we can only partially reconstruct from the imperfect records that the system itself created in the course of managing and exploiting them. The material conditions of rural life in the Plantagenet period, the actual texture of daily existence for the past peasant majority who produced the agricultural surplus on which the entire edifice of medieval civilization rested, deserves sustained attention, precisely because the spectacular episodes of political and military violence that have dominated the historical narrative of the period have tended to obscure the grinding, structural, chronic violence of agricultural poverty and institutional subjection that was the permanent condition of most of the population. The agricultural landscape of Plantagenet England, with its open field system of communally managed strips, its common pastures and meadows, its woodlands and wastes that served essential economic functions for the village community, was a human creation of extraordinary complexity, the product of generations of collective management that had developed intricate systems of custom and regulation governing every aspect of the agricultural economy. The village community that managed this landscape, the meeting of villagers that made collective decisions about planting schedules, about the use of common resources, about the maintenance of field boundaries and drainage ditches, was neither a simple expression of communal harmony nor a straightforward arena of conflict between lord and peasant. It was a social institution of genuine complexity in which relations of gender, age, wealth, and family connection intersected with relations of tenure and obligation in ways that made every significant decision a site of negotiation among multiple interests and multiple claims. The experience of seasonal agricultural labor, the long days of spring plowing, the intensive work of harvest when the entire community's labor was required to bring in the crops before the weather broke, the autumn tasks of threshing and winnowing and storing, the winter maintenance of equipment and buildings and animals was physically demanding in ways that left permanent marks on the bodies of those who performed it. The skeletal evidence from medieval burial sites reveals high rates of arthritis, spinal compression, healed fractures from workplace accidents, and the general evidence of sustained physical labor from early childhood that characterized agricultural work before mechanization. These physical consequences of agricultural life were not distributed equally across the population. The working poor bore them most heavily, while the consuming minority whose labor they sustained bore them least. This asymmetry was not experienced as an injustice requiring explanation within the dominant theological framework of the period, which understood social hierarchy and the allocation of different forms of labor to different social groups as reflecting divine purpose rather than human choice. But the resentment that periodically erupted in collective resistance in the manorial court's documentation of persistent small-scale defiance of lordly authority, in the organized resistance of the peasants' revolt, in the persistent assertion of customary rights against the encroachments of lords and officials, testifies to the experience of injustice, even in the absence of the conceptual framework that would have allowed it to be articulated. As such, the experience of the urban poor in the towns and cities of Plantagenet England adds further dimensions to the understanding of structural violence that the period represents. The rapid growth of urban populations during the 12th and 13th centuries, a growth driven by the expanding commercial economy and by the pull of urban opportunity on rural migrants escaping the constraints of the manorial. A system created conditions in the growing towns that combined economic possibility with physical insecurity and social exposure that was, in some respects, worse than that of the rural poor. Urban workers, particularly those in the textile and building trades that dominated the medieval urban economy, were subject to the rhythms of seasonal demand and technological change that made employment intermittent and wages unpredictable. The absence of the communal resources, access to common land, customary entitlement to gleaning and gathering, the networks of mutual obligation within the village community that provided some minimal buffer against destitution for the rural poor, meant that urban poverty could more quickly become urban starvation, particularly in the periods of harvest failure and commercial contraction that punctuated the medieval economic cycle. The towns of medieval England, for all the institutional sophistication of their guilds and their merchant courts and their charitable institutions, contained populations living in conditions of physical proximity, sanitary inadequacy, and economic insecurity that made epidemic disease a regular and devastating presence in urban life, and that made the experience of urban poverty substantially more dangerous than the romantic narratives of medieval town life have. Typically acknowledged, the final years of Richard II's reign, in which the king's use of the instruments of governance for personal vengeance and political intimidation reached its most systematic and most clearly tyrannical expression, provide a concluding case study of the ways in which the Plantagenet system's coercive mechanisms could be turned by a sufficiently determined king against the very class that had been their primary intended beneficiaries. Richard's use of blank charters, documents signed and sealed by individuals or communities under royal pressure, left blank so that incriminating confessions or financial obligations could subsequently be inserted, was not a novel technique of coercive extraction. It was a particularly extreme application of the principle, operative throughout the Plantagenet period, that the mechanisms of royal legal and financial power could be used to impose obligations on those who lacked the means to resist them. What was novel about Richard's use of this technique was its application to the baronial class itself, whose members were accustomed to experiencing the system's coercive power as an instrument directed against those below them rather than against themselves. The political consequences of this experience, the rapid crystallization of baronial opposition around the invading force of Henry Bolingbroke, the collapse of royal military support when it mattered most, demonstrated that the coercive power of the Plantagenet system had always rested on the implicit cooperation of the baronial class, and that when the system turned against that class directly, the cooperation that sustained it dissolved with a speed that exposed the ultimate fragility of even the most elaborate institutional apparatus of coercion. The historical memory of the Plantagenet period has itself been subject to processes of selection and emphasis that reflect the perspectives and priorities of those who have preserved and transmitted it. The dynastic chronicle tradition that produced the most comprehensive narrative accounts of the period was maintained primarily by monastic scriptoria, whose institutional interests were bound up with the ecclesiastical dimensions of royal governance, and whose perspectives on the events they recorded were shaped accordingly. The legal records that provide the most detailed evidence for the operation of the common law were preserved because they served the ongoing practical needs of a legal system that continued to use earlier precedents as the basis for contemporary decisions. The financial records of the Exchequer were preserved because they documented obligations that might still be pursued or disputed. The documents that recorded the experience of those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, the occasional manorial court roll, the coroner's inquest, the jail delivery record were preserved more accidentally, surviving where the institutional continuity of manorial administration or the bureaucratic tidiness of county archives happened to maintain them, and lost elsewhere in the general entropy that has consumed most of the documentation of medieval England. Reading the history of Plantagenet England against the grain of these selective preservations, attending to what the documents reveal about the experiences they were not designed to document, to the silences and the gaps and the indirect testimonies that allow the lives of the majority to become partially visible through the interstices of a record-keeping system that was designed for other purposes, is one of the most productive and most demanding tasks in medieval historical scholarship. It requires not only the technical skills of paleography and diplomatics and the Latin learning that the documents themselves demand, but the imaginative and analytical willingness to use the evidence of governance for purposes that those who created the evidence did not intend. The peasant woman who appears in a manorial court roll as the subject of an amercement for brewing without license was not placed in the record to testify to her experience of the manorial system, but her presence in the record and the tens of thousands of similar presences accumulated across hundreds of surviving manorial court rolls testifies collectively to a system of surveillance and extraction that penetrated to the most intimate dimensions of domestic, economic life, and to the experience of living within that system as one of continuous exposure to the potential exercise of institutional power over activities that would be understood in a later period as entirely private concerns. The long view of the Plantagenet period, the view that places it within the larger arc of English and European historical development, that traces the consequences of its institutional innovations into the subsequent centuries, and that attempts to measure its contribution to the development of the legal, political, and cultural traditions that later generations would inherit, requires holding simultaneously in view both the genuine achievements of the period and the genuine costs at which those achievements were purchased. The common law that the Plantagenets developed became one of the most influential legal traditions in the history of Western civilization, exported through English colonialism to territories whose populations experienced it in ways that were no less complicated than the experience of the Welsh and the Irish who had encountered it first. The parliament that developed in the shadow of baronial resistance to royal overreach became the model for representative institutions whose long-term contribution to the development of constitutional governance has been among the most consequential in the history of political institutions. The English language, which survived and adapted through the centuries of French-speaking Norman and Plantagenet dominance to emerge in the work of Chaucer and Langland and the Gawain poet as a literary instrument of extraordinary richness, flexibility, became the language of one of the most extensive bodies of literary and intellectual achievement in human history. These are not small things. The Plantagenet period was not simply a story of suffering and exploitation, of political violence and institutional coercion, of the systematic abuse of the weak by the powerful, it was also a story of genuine human achievement, of institutional creativity, of cultural flowering, of the development of forms of social organization and intellectual expression whose influence extends to the present. But the suffering and the exploitation were not incidental to the achievements. They were the conditions within which the achievements were possible, the mechanism through which the resources for those achievements were generated, and the experience of the majority of the population during the period in which those achievements were made. A history of the Plantagenet period that acknowledges only the achievements is incomplete. A history that acknowledges only the suffering is equally incomplete. The task is to hold both in view simultaneously and to understand the ways in which they were related to each other, not as separate features of the same period, but as aspects of a single system whose consequences, the magnificent and the terrible alike, were the products of the same institutional logic operating on the same human material. The brutality of Plantagenet England was real, and it was systematic, and it was consequential, and it demands to be understood on its own terms, not minimized in the interests of a celebratory narrative of institutional progress, nor abstracted into a theoretical account of structural violence that loses sight of the actual people who experienced it. The individuals whose suffering built the foundations on which the achievements of the period rested deserve, at minimum, to be remembered as having suffered, and to be understood as having lived within a system whose operations, however sophisticated and however productive of genuine institutional value, they were experienced by most of those within it as a permanent background of coercive power against which the ordinary business of life had to be conducted with a care and a submission and an acceptance of one's own vulnerability that no subsequent generation of English people has been required to match in quite the same form. The weight of 3 centuries of systematic institutional violence does not lift easily from the historical record, and the process of understanding what that violence meant, not just in its dramatic public episodes, which have always attracted historical attention, but in its mundane, daily operations, its chronic background presence, its shaping of the possibilities available to people who lived within it, remains incomplete. The archives of England contain millions of documents from the Plantagenet period, most of them unread by anyone living, most of them recording transactions and proceedings whose connection to the larger patterns of historical significance is not immediately apparent. Each of those documents represents a moment in the operation of the system, a small piece of the machinery of governance, touching the life of a specific person in a specific place at a specific time. Taken together, they constitute an archive of institutional experience whose full dimensions remain to be mapped, and whose mapping will continue to reveal both the remarkable sophistication of the Plantagenet administrative achievement and the remarkable costs at which that achievement was maintained. The history of Plantagenet England is not finished. It is a continuing project of recovery and interpretation that each generation approaches with different questions, different methods, and different understandings of what historical knowledge is for. The brutality of the period is one of its most stable features, visible from every angle of approach and resistant to the various forms of retrospective sanitization that subsequent periods have sometimes applied to it. It is also one of its most instructive because it reveals, with a clarity that more recent forms of institutional violence have sometimes been able to obscure, the relationship between the production of social wealth and the exercise of coercive power, and the ways in which the most admired institutional achievements of a civilization can be rooted in conditions of human suffering that those achievements simultaneously depended on and worked to render invisible. The question of how memory and narrative have shaped the subsequent understanding of Plantagenet England opens onto one of the most revealing dimensions of the period's legacy. Every generation that has looked back at the Plantagenet centuries has done so with eyes shaped by the political and cultural concerns of its own time, finding in the medieval past confirmation of whatever the present moment seemed to require. The Victorian historians who first brought the institutional history of medieval England into systematic scholarly focus, John Richard Green, William Stubbs, Frederick William Maitland were shaped by liberal political assumptions about the progressive development of constitutional governance that led them to see in the Plantagenet legal and parliamentary innovations the seedbed of English liberty, and to treat the violence and the exclusion and the suffering that accompanied those innovations as regrettable but ultimately secondary features of a story whose primary meaning was the emergence of the rights-bearing individual from the constraints of feudal hierarchy. The Whig interpretation of history, as Herbert Butterfield would later call this perspective, produced scholarship of remarkable erudition and considerable lasting value, while systematically underweighting the experience of those for whom the Plantagenet system was primarily a mechanism of oppression rather than a vehicle of liberation. The revisionist scholarship of the 20th century, increasingly attentive to the experiences of marginalized groups and increasingly skeptical of narratives of progressive institutional development, has brought the brutalities of the Plantagenet system into much sharper historiographical focus. The development of social history as a major field of historical inquiry associated with the Analyse school in France and with the British tradition of history from below created intellectual frameworks and methodological tools for recovering the experiences of people who left no literary records of their own. The quantitative analysis of the fiscal and legal records of the period, the systematic study of tax assessment records, manorial accounts, court rolls, and coroners' inquests has made it possible to speak with much greater precision about the material conditions and the institutional experiences of the majority of the medieval English population than was possible for historians working solely from the narrative sources. The resulting picture is considerably less comfortable than the Whig narrative, but it is also, arguably, considerably more honest about the full range of human experience that the Plantagenet centuries encompassed. The specifically coercive dimensions of the forest law system, examined through the records of the forest courts that survive from the 13th and 14th centuries, reveal with exceptional clarity the way in which the institutional apparatus of the Plantagenet state extended its reach into the most intimate details of rural economic life. The forests of Dean and the New Forest, the great chases of Yorkshire and Northumberland, the forests of the Midlands and East Anglia, each of these represented an area of land within which the normal conditions of agricultural life were modified by the operation of special legal rules that protected the king's interest in game at the expense of the resident population's interest in agricultural productivity and domestic subsistence. The men and women who lived within or adjacent to these forest areas, the smallholders and cottagers who kept pigs in the woodland, the farmers whose sheep strayed onto forest pasture, the charcoal burners and woodcutters whose livelihoods depended on access to forest resources, encountered the forest law, not as an abstract legal principle, but as a concrete administrative presence in the form of forest officials, who monitored their activities, recorded their infractions, and presented them for amercement before the forest courts that gathered periodically to assess the accumulated violations of the forest regime. The social consequences of this monitoring the resentment of communities whose access to woodland resources was restricted by rules that they had no role in making and no effective means of challenging, the periodic eruption of that resentment into direct resistance against forest officials, the maintenance of a parallel economy of illicit forest use that continued regardless of official prohibition, are all visible in the documentary record of the period, providing evidence for the lived experience of institutional coercion that the more spectacular episodes of the political narrative tend to overshadow. The gendered dimensions of forest law enforcement provide a particularly instructive example of the ways in which the multiple hierarchies of the Plantagenet system intersected and reinforced each other in the lives of specific individuals. Women who brewed ale for sale, a common domestic economic activity that was one of the few independent income-generating opportunities available to women within the manorial economy, were subject not only to the manorial court's jurisdiction over unlicensed brewing, but also, when they lived within forest areas, to the forest court's interest in whether the grain used in their brewing had been obtained through legitimate means. The overlap of jurisdictions, the multiplication of potential grounds for immersement, and the absence of any institutional framework for coordinating or limiting the cumulative financial impact of multiple systems of regulatory oversight on a single household's precarious economic position, were characteristic features of the Plantagenet institutional landscape that fell most heavily on those least able to absorb additional financial burdens. Understanding this multiplication of coercive pressures, rather than studying each institutional system in isolation, is essential to understanding the experience of ordinary people within the Plantagenet world, the intellectual culture of the period, which produced some of the most sophisticated theological, legal, and philosophical thinking of the medieval Western tradition, existed in a relationship of productive but uncomfortable tension with the brutal social conditions within which it was generated. The scholastic philosophers and theologians of the 12th and 13th centuries, figures like John of Salisbury, Thomas Aquinas in his English Reception, Robert Grosseteste, Roger Bacon, were engaged in genuinely ambitious attempts to understand the relationship between reason and faith, between natural law and positive law, between the obligations of rulers and the rights of subjects, that produced intellectual frameworks of lasting importance. But the conditions within which this intellectual work was conducted, the patronage structures that made it dependent on ecclesiastical and royal approval, the institutional settings of the cathedral schools, and the emerging universities that shaped the questions that could be asked and the answers that could be given, the social position of the scholars themselves as members of a clerical class whose privileges were maintained by the same institutional system, whose operations they sometimes critiqued, meant that the critical potential of medieval intellectual culture was always operating under constraints that tended to limit its reach to questions that could be answered without fundamentally threatening the interests of those who maintained the conditions of intellectual life. The medical and scientific culture of the Plantagenet period, though operating within intellectual frameworks very different from those of later scientific traditions, made genuine contributions to the understanding of the natural world and the treatment of human illness that deserve recognition alongside the more dramatic achievements of legal and literary culture. The medical schools associated with cathedral chapters and with the emerging universities, Oxford received its university charter in the course of the 12th century, and Cambridge followed in the 13th, produced practitioners whose knowledge of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical technique, though limited by the absence of germ theory and by theoretical frameworks that attributed disease to humoral imbalance rather than to microbiological causes, was considerably more sophisticated than the popular narrative of medieval ignorance has tended to acknowledge. The treatment of wounds in military contexts, a practically important matter in a society that generated military casualties at the rates that Plantagenet England did, produced empirical knowledge of surgical technique that was communicated through a tradition of practical apprenticeship, whose results appear in the survival of patients whose bones show evidence of successful surgical intervention in the archaeological record. The herbal medicine practiced by the healers, both the formally trained physicians associated with ecclesiastical institutions and the informal folk healers, whose knowledge was transmitted outside any institutional framework, drew on a pharmacological tradition whose effectiveness for some conditions has been confirmed by subsequent chemical analysis of the plants whose use it recommended. The architectural history of the period, beyond its well-documented cathedrals and castles, encompasses the development of a distinctive tradition of domestic and agricultural building, whose surviving examples, barns, manor houses, bridges, mills, testify to the technical sophistication and the organizational capacity of a building tradition that operated without the formal theoretical framework that would characterize later architectural practice. The great tithe barns of the 13th and 14th centuries, structures like the barn at Bradford-on-Avon in Wiltshire or the barn complex at Cressing Temple in Essex, are engineering achievements of genuine importance, demonstrating mastery of timber frame construction on a scale that required both technical knowledge and organizational capacity sufficient to coordinate the work of teams of skilled craftsmen over periods of months or years. These structures were built to serve the economic purposes of ecclesiastical or manorial estates to store the tithes in grain that the church extracted from the agricultural population, to hold the harvest surplus of great demesne farms. And they testify simultaneously to the technical achievement of their builders and to the scale of the extraction that made their construction necessary and economically justified. The history of Plantagenet England, in its full complexity, its institutional achievements, and its systematic brutalities, its cultural flowering and its structural violence, its genuine legal innovations and its consistent deployment of those innovations in the service of coercive power, is a history that resists the simplifications that different traditions of historiography have imposed on it. It is not the progressive story of the development of English liberty that the Whig tradition constructed from its most admirable features. It is not the simple story of feudal oppression that a reductive social history might construct from its most brutal ones. It is the story of a specific form of social organization, embedded in specific material conditions and specific cultural frameworks, that produce specific patterns of human achievement and specific patterns of human suffering in ways that were deeply and inextricably connected. Understanding that connection, understanding why the same system that produced Magna Carta and the Common Law and Gothic architecture and Chaucer also produced the massacre at Berwick and the death of Becket and the expulsion of the Peric, Jews and the peasants' revolt, and the systematic exploitation of the villain majority, is the task that the history of the period sets for those who are willing to engage with it in its full moral and intellectual complexity. That task is not made easier by the distance of the intervening centuries, but it is made possible and urgently necessary by the extraordinary richness of the documentary record that the administrative ambition of the Plantagenet system itself created and that has survived, incompletely but substantially, to make the recovery of that full complexity a genuine historical possibility rather than merely an aspiration.